The train slowed with a grinding reluctance, as if even the locomotive had doubts about stopping in a place like Copper Bluff. Scarlett Hayes sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching through the smudged window as the town materialized out of the desert. A cluster of sun-bleached buildings, a water tower with a crack running up one side, and a main street so dusty it looked like the earth itself had given up trying. She had pictured something different. She had pictured it 100 times on the long journey west, filling in the gaps of Harold Ames's letters with her own imagination. A modest but respectable town, a man who meant what he wrote, a life that was smaller than what she'd known in Richmond, but honest in ways that mattered. What she had not pictured was the envelope. The porter handed it to her just before the train pulled into the station, apologetic in the way only strangers can be when delivering someone else's terrible news. "A gentleman left this at the depot in advance, ma'am. Asked that it be given to a Miss Hayes arriving on the noon train." She had taken it without a word. She had held it for 3 minutes without opening it, which told her everything she needed to know about what she already suspected. When she finally tore the flap open, the letter inside was not long. Harold Ames had never been a man of excessive words, and in this at least, he had been consistent. "Miss Hayes, after considerable reflection, I have concluded that our arrangement is no longer something I can in good conscience pursue. Circumstances in Copper Bluff have changed. I trust you will understand and make appropriate arrangements for your return journey. I have included $5 to assist with the inconvenience. H. Ames, $5. He had attached $5 to the letter with a small brass pin, as though the sum were adequate compensation for the humiliation of traveling 1,000 miles to be rejected before she could step off the train. Scarlett read the letter twice. Then she folded it very carefully, tucked it back into the envelope, and placed the envelope inside her traveling bag. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the days before leaving Richmond, when the decision to accept Harold Ames's proposal had felt like both a surrender and a lifeline, a way out of a city where her father's debts had made her an object of quiet pity and louder gossip. She was 26 years old and had already exhausted the patience of polite society. She was not going to spend whatever was left of her dignity weeping on a train platform in front of strangers. She stood up, straightened her jacket, picked up her valise, and walked to the door. The platform at Copper Bluff was not crowded. A handful of men loading freight, 2 women with a child between them. A boy chasing a dog with more energy than purpose. But Scarlett felt every set of eyes the moment she descended the steps, and she understood with the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose that word had already traveled. It always did, in towns this small. Harold Ames had left that letter days ago. Days was long enough. "That her?" she heard someone murmur, low enough to pretend she wasn't meant to hear it. She walked to the end of the platform and stood looking at Copper Bluff's main street without moving. The sun was fierce, even at noon in early autumn. The smell of the place reached her. Dust, hoarse, something faintly metallic she couldn't identify. A general store. A saloon with its doors propped open. A small bank with pretensions above its actual size. A sheriff's office with a man leaning against the doorframe who wasn't looking at her, but was very deliberately not looking at her, which amounted to the same thing. She had $42.30 remaining in her purse after the train fare. She had a valise containing 2 changes of clothing, a small collection of practical items she'd assembled before leaving Richmond, and the stitching kit her mother had pressed into her hands at the station with a look that said everything her mouth wouldn't. She did not have a plan. What she had was the certain knowledge that she was not getting back on that train. East. The town's only hotel was called the Frontier House, which was grander in name than in execution. The woman at the front desk was perhaps 50, with a face that had spent decades making calculations about people and rarely arrived at favorable conclusions. She looked at Scarlett's valise, then at Scarlett's face, then back at the valise. $2 a night, she said. Meals extra. "I'll take a room for 2 nights to start," Scarlett said. "Is there a bathhouse?" "Down the alley, 50 cents. Scarlett paid for the room and carried her own bag upstairs without being offered assistance. The room was small and clean enough, with a window that looked out over the side alley rather than the street. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment after closing the door, letting herself feel the full weight of where she was and what had happened, because she had found over the years that trying to outrun a bad feeling only meant it chased you faster. She was in a strange town. She had been publicly discarded. She had enough money to last perhaps 3 weeks if she was careful, fewer if anything went wrong. She did not know a single person in Copper Bluff. She thought about her sister Agnes back in Richmond, who would be quietly smug when the news reached her. She thought about Harold Ames and his $5 conscience. She thought about the way the women on the platform had looked at her, not with cruelty exactly, but with the particular brand of female sympathy that contained within it a warning. This is what happens when you trust a letter over a man you've never met. Then she washed her face, unpinned her hair, repinned it more securely, and went downstairs to ask where she might find work. The woman at the desk, whose name turned out to be Mrs. Calloway, was not unkind, only guarded, in the way of someone who had learned that being too generous with strangers was a transaction that rarely paid off. When Scarlett explained her situation plainly, without embellishment or self-pity, Mrs. Calloway's expression shifted a fraction. "You can sew?" she asked. "Yes." "Cook?" "Adequately. I'm better at organization than cooking, if I'm being honest." Something almost like approval crossed Mrs. Calloway's face. "Most women who come through here claiming to be capable aren't," she said. "The ones who say they can do everything can usually do nothing worth paying for. What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything honest," Scarlett said. "I'm not going home." Mrs. Calloway studied her for a moment. "There's not much for a woman alone in Copper Bluff," she said finally. "Domestic work, mostly. Some of the ranches need household help, but it's rough living. It's not like working for a family in town." "I didn't come west for gentle living." The older woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You might speak to Wade Mercer. He runs a cattle operation out about 4 miles north, Mercer Ridge. Lost his housekeeper 2 months back, hasn't replaced her. Place is reportedly going to ruin on the domestic side. He comes into town Thursdays for supplies." She paused. "He's not an easy man." "I'm not in a position to require easy," Scarlett said. Well, she spent the rest of that first afternoon learning the geography of Copper Bluff, which did not take long. It was a town of perhaps 400 people, built along the spine of a single main street with smaller roads branching off like ribs. The significant establishments were the general store run by a man named Purvis, the bank operated by a Mr. Caldwell, the saloon called the Copper Nail, a small church, a schoolhouse, and a doctor's office whose occupant appeared to spend a great deal of time out front smoking a pipe and reading newspapers several weeks old. She also learned within the first hour of walking those streets that her arrival and the circumstances surrounding it had already been thoroughly absorbed by the town's social organism. It started small. A woman outside the milliner's shop who stopped talking to her companion when Scarlett passed and resumed talking in a lower tone the moment she'd gone by. A man outside the general store who gave her a look that tried to be sympathetic but landed somewhere closer to speculative. A girl, perhaps 12, who stared at her with the unguarded curiosity of childhood and was yanked away by her mother before she could ask whatever she'd been about to ask. Scarlett kept her face neutral and her pace steady. She had grown up in Richmond in circumstances that had taught her the specific art of moving through social hostility without letting it show on her face. It was not a skill she'd ever wanted. It was one she was grateful to have. What she had not anticipated was Harold Ames himself. She saw him at 3:30, coming out of the bank with another man in a good suit. He was shorter than she'd imagined from his letters. She wasn't sure why she'd imagined him tall. With a neat mustache, and the kind of handsomeness that photographs better than it wears in person. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and for one unguarded second his face showed something she could only read as embarrassed alarm. Then he composed himself and kept walking, as if she were someone he barely recognized. His companion leaned in and said something low, and Harold Ames laughed. It was a careful, controlled laugh, the kind that says, "This is nothing, she is nothing, I am not unsettled in the least." And Scarlett heard every note of it from across the street. She stood still for a moment. Her hands were at her sides. She thought very clearly, "I will not give him the satisfaction of watching me flinch." Then she walked on. Thursday came, and with it Wade Mercer. She recognized him before Mrs. Calloway pointed him out, which might have been luck or might have been that he looked exactly like what she needed him to be. A man who used himself hard and didn't complain about it. He was perhaps 35, lean in the way of men who work rather than men who exercise, with sun-darkened skin and the kind of hands that came from years of fence post and rope. His clothes were clean but showed their age. He moved through the general store with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned to waste nothing, including time. Mrs. Calloway had arranged the introduction with the practicality of a woman solving a logistical problem. "Wade, this is Miss Scarlett Hayes. She's looking for domestic work. You're looking for a housekeeper." Wade Mercer looked at Scarlett the way she imagined he looked at a fence that needed mending, assessing the scope of the job without any particular feeling about it. "You're the one Ames left that letter for," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. "You planning to stay in Copper Bluff?" "Yes." "Why?" It was a direct question and deserved a direct answer. "Because going back would mean letting him win, and I don't think he's earned that." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Wade Mercer's expression. Not approval exactly, but a reassessment. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "The work is hard," he said. "The house has been neglected. There's cooking, cleaning, laundry, garden work, and whatever else needs doing. I can pay $8 a month to start, with room and board included." "10," Scarlett said. He looked at her. $10 a month, she repeated. "I won't negotiate against myself, Mr. Mercer. If the house is as neglected as you're suggesting, you're getting a bargain." "You don't know what the house looks like." "No, but I know what neglected looks like, and I know what it costs to fix. $10. Another pause, longer this time. He turned the hat once more and then put it back on his head, which she took to mean the conversation was ending one way or another. "9, he said, "and I won't dock your wages for the first month while you learn the place." 9.5, Scarlett said, because she had decided in that moment that a man who would negotiate was a man who was capable of respect, and she wanted to establish that she expected it. "And I have conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "I want it understood that I am an employee, not a dependent. My wages are my own. My time outside of working hours is my own. I will not be spoken to with disrespect, and I will not tolerate gossip about my character from anyone in your employ or your household." Wade Mercer studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze because she had nothing to lose by doing so and everything to lose by looking away. 9.5, he said finally. "Your conditions are acceptable. You start Monday." He walked away without another word, which she decided to interpret as efficiency rather than rudeness. She spent the rest of Thursday and all of Friday preparing for what was coming and trying not to think too hard about the fact that she had just agreed to live and work in a stranger's home miles outside of a town that already regarded her with a mixture of scandal and pity. On Saturday morning, Harold Ames found her. She was at the dry goods counter in Purvis's store, making a list of what she would need to bring with her to the ranch, when he appeared at her elbow with the careful casualness of someone who has rehearsed the encounter. He smelled of bay rum and mild self-satisfaction. "Miss Hayes," he said, as if they were the most natural words in the world. "I heard you've been causing quite the stir." She did not turn immediately. She finished writing the last item on her list because she was done rearranging herself to accommodate his comfort. Then she turned. "Mr. Ames." "I hope there are no hard feelings," he said. The mustache moved in a way that suggested a smile. "These things happen. I trust you understand that a man in my position—" "What position is that?" she asked pleasantly. He paused. "I simply mean that circumstances changed. I had hoped the letter would soften the disappointment." "The $5 was a particularly thoughtful touch," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. "I was trying to be practical." "I know you were." She folded her list and put it in her pocket. "Was there something specific you wanted, Mr. Ames? Or did you come over to reassure yourself that I'm properly devastated?" The smile disappeared. "I came to make sure there wasn't going to be any trouble," he said, in a voice that had dropped its pleasantness and found something harder underneath. "You're a stranger here. You don't know how things work. I have friends in this town, people who matter. It would be in your best interest to conduct yourself in a way that doesn't cause problems." Scarlett looked at him for a moment. She thought about everything she could say, the precise and cutting reply she had been composing in the back of her mind since the train, and then she decided that none of it was worth giving him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to be either cringing or furious, because either one would tell him he still had power over her situation, She gave him neither. "Thank you for the advice," she said, picked up her basket, and walked to the next counter. She heard him standing behind her for a moment, very still, and then the sound of him leaving. Her hands were steady. She was somewhat surprised by that. Wade Mercer sent a ranch hand named Cody to collect her and her luggage on Monday morning with a wagon that had seen better decades. Cody was perhaps 19, freckled, and so visibly awkward about having to transport a woman who'd been publicly humiliated that she almost felt sorry for him. "Mr. Mercer says I'm to help with your bags," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Thank you, Cody," she said, and handed him the heavier of the two she'd packed. He fumbled with it in a way that suggested he wasn't sure how to behave, then seemed to decide that treating her like any other passenger was the safest approach, which was the correct decision. They rode out of Copper Bluff in the thin morning light, the desert spreading out around them in shades of rust and pale gold, and Scarlett sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the landscape she'd agreed to live inside. It was enormous. That was the first thing that struck her. Not beautiful in any conventional sense, but enormous in a way that made the problems she'd been carrying feel temporarily smaller by comparison. The sky went on for what felt like longer than a sky should be allowed to go. The hills in the distance were the color of old brick, scrub and sage and the occasional tree that looked like it had survived through sheer stubbornness. "Have you worked at Mercer Ridge long?" she asked Cody, partly to be friendly and partly because information was useful. 3 years, he said. "Since I was 16. What's it like?" He considered this with the particular thoughtfulness of someone not accustomed to being asked his opinion. "Hard," he said, "but fair. Mr. Mercer doesn't ask for what he won't do himself. That matters." "It does," she agreed. The ranch appeared over a low ridge about 40 minutes from town. A collection of buildings that had clearly been functional before they'd been comfortable, with a main house, a barn, several outbuildings, and a series of fenced pastures where cattle moved in the slow, indifferent way of animals that don't understand they're the entire point. The house was wood-framed, 2 stories, once painted white and now more of a weathered gray. The porch had a board missing from the middle step. The window boxes had been empty long enough that whatever had once been planted in them had desiccated entirely. Cody pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Wade Mercer came out through the front door, holding a mug of coffee, and looked at her the same way he'd looked at her in the general store, measuring without expectation. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for assistance, which she saw him note. "Shall we start with the kitchen?" "We shall," he said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite identify, the very beginning of something that might eventually become respect. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected, which was saying something because she had prepared herself to expect bad. It was not dirty so much as abandoned, the kind of space that had been used for basic necessities and nothing more, where things had been allowed to accumulate and deteriorate simply because there was no one around to care whether they deteriorated or not. The iron stove was filmed with grease. The shelves were in disorder. Half the dry goods stored in the pantry were improperly sealed and showed signs of having attracted company. "Your housekeeper left 2 months ago, you said?" Scarlett asked, standing in the pantry doorway. "About that," Wade said from behind her. "What was her name?" "Mrs. Finch." "And before her?" He paused. "There were a couple of others. It's an isolated posting. Women don't tend to stay." She turned and looked at him. "Did you treat them poorly?" He seemed taken aback by the directness, though not offended by it. "No," he said after a moment. "I think they found it lonelier than they expected." "Are you warning me?" "I'm answering your question." She considered that. "All right," she said. "I'm going to need a list of every supply you have and every supply you're missing. I'm going to need that board on the porch step replaced before someone breaks an ankle, probably mine. And I'd like to know who else works here and what their schedule is so I can plan meals properly. Cody you've met. I have 3 other ranch hands, Tom, Bill, and a man everyone calls Dutch, though that's not his name. They eat breakfast at 6 and supper at 7. I eat whenever there's food. I don't require anything particular." "Everyone requires something particular," she said. "You just haven't had anyone around to notice what yours is." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't read. "I'll get Cody to fix that step today," he said. "Jet the pishi." The first week at Mercer Ridge was the hardest physical week of Scarlett Hayes' life, and she had spent a week nursing her mother through influenza in a house with a broken furnace in the middle of January, so that was not nothing. She attacked the kitchen first because it was both the most necessary and the most demoralizing space, and she had learned that you could tell a great deal about the state of a household from the condition of its kitchen. She boiled water and scrubbed surfaces. She reorganized the pantry, throwing out what was beyond saving and cataloging what remained. She found 3 cast iron pans buried under a pile of miscellaneous iron objects, cleaned and re-seasoned them, and established a system for their storage that would keep them in usable condition. She fixed the curtains in the parlor, which had been hanging at a dispirited angle from a single hook each. She attacked the layer of dust on every horizontal surface with a focus that surprised even her, moving through the house room by room with the methodical determination of someone who had decided that the state of this space was a problem that existed to be solved. She cooked. She had undersold her cooking ability to Wade Mercer, not from dishonesty but from caution, because promising more than you could deliver was a trap she'd seen other women fall into. She could cook well, actually, in the solid and practical tradition of women who had grown up in households where the cook left and was not immediately replaced. Her biscuits were reliable. Her stews were the kind that didn't require apology. By the third evening, Cody had stopped eating with the mechanical joylessness of a man fueling himself and started eating like a person who was tasting his food. "This is different," he said, in a tone of mild amazement. "Different how?" she asked. "Better," he said, as if the word surprised him on the way out. She had less success with the garden, which was beyond reviving for the current season. Whatever had been planted there had died in the summer heat without consistent watering, and the soil had compacted to a point that would require real work before it could support anything worth growing. But she turned the soil anyway, because even if nothing could be planted until spring, preparing the ground was not wasted effort. She worked at it in the evenings after the supper dishes were done, in the last hour of light, with a fork she'd found in the barn. Wade Mercer found her there on the 5th evening, still at it, her arms aching in a way she refused to acknowledge. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and kept digging. He stood watching her for a moment with his hands in his pockets. The last woman who tried to grow something in that garden gave up after a week. "She probably tried to plant before she prepared the soil," Scarlett said. "You can't rush that part. Most people don't have the patience for it." She stopped and straightened her back, looking out at the turned earth. "I grew up watching my mother try to make things grow in soil that wasn't much better than this," she said. "She never gave up on it. I suppose I inherited that." She hadn't meant to say that much. She turned back to the work to avoid whatever response might come, but Wade Mercer didn't offer one. He just stood there a little longer in the cooling evening and then walked back toward the barn. It was, she thought later, the most comfortable silence she'd spent in another person's company in a long time. The second week the town came for her. She had known it would, in some form. The specific form was Margaret Ellison, wife of the town's largest property owner, who arrived at the ranch on Tuesday morning in a buggy that probably cost more than Scarlett earned in a year. Mrs. Ellison was perhaps 55, dressed as though Copper Bluff were Philadelphia, and wearing the expression of someone who had come to deliver a verdict she'd already reached before leaving home. Wade Mercer was out with the cattle. Cody was repairing fence a quarter-mile out. There was no one at the house when the buggy pulled up, but Scarlett, who was hanging laundry on the line she'd restrung behind the house. She walked around to the front when she heard the wheels and stood watching Mrs. Ellison descend from the buggy with the assistance of a young man who drove it. "Miss Hayes," Mrs. Ellison said, as though there might be some other woman doing laundry at Mercer Ridge Ranch. "Yes," Scarlett said. "I'm Margaret Ellison. My husband is on the town council." She said this the way people say things when they expect the mention of the council to do a specific kind of work. "Would you like to come inside?" Scarlett asked. "I won't be long." Mrs. Ellison looked around the property with the careful assessment of someone who wants you to know they're assessing. "I've come on behalf of some of the ladies in town. There is some concern," she paused to find the appropriate word, "about the arrangement you've entered into here." "What kind of concern?" "An unmarried woman living and working in an unmarried man's household. You understand, people talk." Scarlett looked at her steadily. "People have been talking since I stepped off the train," she said. "It hasn't affected the quality of my work." It affects your reputation, Miss Hayes. My reputation, Scarlett said carefully, was decided by this town before I unpacked my valise. I don't believe living in a rooming house instead of this ranch would have changed that substantially. Mrs. Ellison's chin came up a fraction. I'm trying to help you. I appreciate that, I think. Scarlett kept her voice level. If there are specific concerns about how I conduct myself at this ranch, I would hear them. If the concern is simply that it looks improper for me to be employed here, I'm afraid I can't do very much about that without giving up honest work, and I'm not willing to do that. There are other options for a woman in your situation. What situation is that exactly, Mrs. Ellison? A pause. The older woman had the grace to look faintly uncomfortable. You arrived here as a mail-order bride and were, I arrived here as an adult woman who had entered a legal arrangement with another adult who chose to break that arrangement, Scarlett said. I'm not sure that constitutes a situation, as opposed to a simple fact. Mrs. Ellison looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in the older woman's eyes. Not approval, but a kind of recalibration. She had come expecting a woman who needed to be managed and had found something else. You are very direct, she said. I find it saves time, Scarlett said. Would you like coffee? I made a fresh pot an hour ago. Another pause, then, surprising both of them, I suppose I would, said Margaret Ellison. They sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee in a silence that was not entirely hostile, and Scarlett answered questions about her background and her family and what had brought her west with the steady honesty of someone who had decided that the truth was easier to maintain than any alternative. Mrs. Ellison listened without interrupting, which Scarlett took as a sign of intelligence, if not of immediate sympathy. When she left an hour later, she said only, You are not what I expected, Miss Hayes. No, Scarlett said. I rarely am. She found out what Harold Ames had been doing in the 2 weeks since her arrival through the accidental channel of Cody, who had heard it from Tom, who had a brother who drank at the Coppernail and had witnessed it firsthand. Harold Ames had been telling a story. The story varied in its details depending on the telling, but its central character was always the same. A woman from Richmond who had pursued him inappropriately, had misunderstood the nature of their correspondence, and had arrived in Copper Bluff despite his attempts to communicate clearly that there was no understanding between them. In some versions, she had been financially desperate and calculated in her pursuit. In others, she had been emotionally unstable. In the version that had apparently reached the farthest, she was both. Scarlett heard all of this on a Wednesday evening when Cody, having clearly been wrestling with whether to tell her, finally decided that knowing was better than not knowing. He told her while she was washing up after supper, his freckled face reddened with secondhand embarrassment. I thought you should know, he said. I'm sorry, Miss Hayes. It ain't right. She kept washing. The dishwater was getting cold. Thank you for telling me, Cody, she said. You're not going to do anything about it? I'm going to think about what to do about it, she said. Those are different things. After he left, she stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the dark where the desert lay beyond the fence line. She was angry. She let herself be angry because suppressing it would only mean it went sideways later. She was angry at Harold Ames for his cowardice and his vanity. She was angry at the ease with which a man could rewrite a story and have it believed. She was angry at herself, a little, for having believed his letters in the first place, though she was trying to be fair about that because his letters had been genuinely convincing, which was its own kind of gift for dishonesty. But underneath the anger was something harder and more durable. She had survived the letter on the train. She had survived the platform and Mrs. Ellison's visit and Harold Ames's dismissal in the street. She was still standing. She was still working. She had $9.50 coming at the end of the month and a house that was beginning to look like somewhere a person could actually live. Harold Ames was not going to take that from her. She went to bed that night with her jaw set and her mind turning over the various shapes of what came next, and she slept better than she had since leaving Richmond. On Friday of her second week at Mercer Ridge, Wade Mercer did something that surprised her. He came into the kitchen at 7 in the morning before the ranch hands, which was unusual. He typically ate with the men or not at all. He poured himself coffee, sat down at the table, and said, I heard what Ames is saying around town. She was at the stove, and she kept her eyes on what she was doing. And? I wanted you to know I don't believe it. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, not at her, which made the words feel more considered rather than less. "Why are you telling me that?" He looked up. "Because you deserve to know somebody in this town is paying attention to the difference between what somebody says and what's actually true." It was more words than he usually deployed at once, and she got the sense he had thought about saying them before he said them. She turned back to the stove. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. I just don't have much patience for men who use women as convenient explanations for their own failures." She kept her attention on the pan in front of her. The eggs were not burning, but she wasn't sure she would have noticed if they had. "He came to the store before I hired you," Wade continued. "Told me not to. Said you were unstable, that you'd be trouble." She turned again. "You hired me anyway." "I hired you because you told me you wouldn't negotiate against yourself," he said. "That's not what an unstable person does. That's what a person who knows their own worth does." She stood looking at him for a moment in the morning kitchen, in the unremarkable light, with the sound of the ranch starting up outside, and everything about her current life being exactly as uncertain and difficult as it had been 10 days ago. And she felt something shift, not dramatically, not in any way that would make a good story on its own, but genuinely. The way things shift when the weight that's been pressing on you redistributes itself slightly differently, and you realize you can breathe a degree more freely than before. "The eggs are going to burn," Wade said. She turned back to the stove. "So they are," she said, and saved them. The eggs she'd saved that Friday morning turned out to be a small thing, but small things have a way of meaning more than they should when everything else is uncertain. Scarlett thought about what Wade had said for the rest of that day and most of the weekend. Not obsessively, not in the way of a woman with nothing else to occupy her mind, but in the background, the way you keep checking on something you're not sure is real. He had defended her before he'd even met her. He had hired her in spite of what Harold Ames had said, and then he had told her so, plainly, without making it into something she owed him for. She hadn't encountered many people in her life who operated that way. She filed it away and kept working. By the end of her third week at Mercer Ridge, the house had a different quality to it. Not transformed, she was too practical to use that word about 3 weeks of labor, but functional in a way it apparently hadn't been in some time. The kitchen ran properly. Meals arrived when they were supposed to, hot, and in sufficient quantity that the ranch hands stopped eating with the mechanical urgency of men afraid the food would be gone before they'd had enough. The parlor had been cleaned and reorganized, and while there was no question of making it elegant, it was at least a room where a person could sit without feeling the accumulated weight of neglect pressing down on them. Cody had fixed the porch step on the day Wade asked him to. It was a small thing, but she noticed it every time she walked out the front door, and it bothered her slightly less with each passing day that she had needed to ask for it at all. The ranch hands treated her with a careful, collective respect that she suspected Wade had engineered without making it obvious. Tom was in his 40s, quiet, with the distant manner of a man who had learned that conversation was usually more trouble than silence. Bill was talkative in the way of men who are lonely but don't know it, and he asked her questions about Richmond with a hungry curiosity that she found endearing rather than intrusive. Dutch, who turned out to be a rangy man from Missouri, whose actual name was apparently a point of some privacy, watched her from a careful distance for the first week and a half before one evening at supper saying, entirely unprompted, "You make the best coffee I've had since I left home," and thereafter treating her like a person he'd decided to trust. These were small victories. She knew they were small. But she had learned, in the compressed and difficult education of the past month, that small victories were what survival was made of, and that people who waited for the large ones often starved in the meantime. The garden was the thing that began to change her relationship with the place itself. She had started turning the soil in those last light evening hours, not because she expected anything immediate from it, but because the physical work settled her mind in a way that indoors work didn't. Inside the house, her thoughts ran on rails, task to task, practical and necessary. Outside, with the fork in the earth and the sky going orange and then purple over the hills, her mind could move differently. She had never particularly thought of herself as someone who needed that kind of space. She was discovering she'd simply never had it before. She ordered seeds through Purvis's general store, which required a degree of conversation with Purvis himself that she'd been avoiding. He was a stout man with a calculating face who had clearly heard every version of her story and was still sorting out which to believe. He took her order with professional neutrality and delivered it in the same register. and she paid him and thanked him and left, and considered that a reasonable outcome for a first real exchange. The seeds arrived in 2 weeks. She planted spinach and winter squash, which had some chance against the autumn temperatures, and made preparations for a spring planting that would be more ambitious. Tomatoes, peppers, beans, root vegetables. She didn't know whether she'd still be at Mercer Ridge in spring. She planted anyway, because leaving a garden ready for spring was no kind of commitment to staying, and because the act of planning for something 3 months out felt, in a quiet way she didn't examine too closely, like believing in her own future. Wade found her at the garden again, on a Saturday evening in her 3rd week. He came around the side of the house with a fence post digger over one shoulder, returning from something, and stopped when he saw her kneeling in the turned earth pressing seeds into channels she'd made with her finger. "You actually got seeds," he said. "I said I was going to. Most people say things." He set down the post digger and stood watching for a moment. The evening light was doing what it did out here, turning everything briefly gold. "What did you plant?" "Spinach, squash. I've made beds for spring. Tomatoes, beans, a few other things." "Spring's a long way off." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Yes," she said. He seemed to understand the implication of that and wasn't sure what to do with it. He picked up the post digger again. "Dutch mentioned your coffee," he said, with what she was beginning to recognize as his particular style of approaching a subject sideways. "He doesn't mention things unless they matter to him." "I noticed that about him," she said. "You notice things," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I pay attention," she said. "It's free." He almost smiled. She was beginning to be able to identify when he was almost smiling, which was as close as he generally got during working hours. "I'm going to be in Copper Bluff on Tuesday," he said. "If you need anything from town, supply order, anything personal, I'll make you a list." "All right," he said, and went on toward the barn. She looked back at the seeds she'd pressed into the earth, waiting for something she couldn't quite name. The evening had cooled to the point where it was almost comfortable. Somewhere in the pasture, a cow made a sound of moderate complaint. She put it down as progress. Tuesday came, and with it an education in how comprehensively Harold Ames had been at work. She had not planned to go to town herself, but Cody was making the supply run with Wade, and she found, upon finishing the morning work, that she had a letter to post to her sister Agnes, the first communication she'd managed since arriving in Copper Bluff, and that posting it couldn't wait another week. She rode in on the wagon's bench beside Cody, who talked about cattle for most of the journey in the easy, detailed way of someone talking about the only thing they know thoroughly. She posted the letter at the depot without incident. She stopped at the dry goods store for a few items on her own list. It was when she was leaving the dry goods store that she encountered Clara Booth. Clara Booth was perhaps 20, with the bright, anxious face of someone who has learned to read rooms quickly because her safety depends on it. Scarlett had seen her briefly in her first days in town without knowing who she was. She found out now because Clara Booth appeared at her elbow as she was leaving Purvis's with her small parcel and said, in a low, urgent voice, "Miss Hayes?" Scarlett stopped. "Yes. I'm sorry to stop you like this." Clara glanced over her shoulder in the direction of the bank. "I know we haven't been introduced properly. I'm Clara Booth. I'm engaged to Harold Ames." Scarlett looked at her for a moment. "Was," she repeated carefully. "Or are?" Clara's expression did something complicated. "Are," she said. "Still, for now." Another glance over her shoulder. "I wanted to tell you what he's been saying about you in town. I don't believe it. I know what his letters sound like. I know how he—" She stopped herself. "I just wanted you to know that someone knows the truth of it." "Why are you telling me?" Scarlett asked, not unkindly. The girl was frightened of something. The way she kept looking over her shoulder was not the nervousness of someone worried about gossip. It was something more specific than that. Clara met her eyes. "Because you're still here," she said, "and I think it took something that I don't know if I have." Scarlett studied her for a moment. Clara Booth was wearing a high-collared dress on a day that was still warm enough to make that uncomfortable, and she held her left arm slightly differently from her right. It was the kind of thing you noticed if you were paying attention and wished you weren't. "Miss Booth," she said carefully, "are you all right?" Clara's chin came up in a gesture Scarlett recognized because she'd made it herself 100 times. The gesture of a woman deciding whether to be honest or safe and trying to determine whether there was a difference. "I'm fine," she said. "All right," Scarlett said. She pulled one of her cards from her pocket. She had a small supply remaining from Richmond in a case she'd almost left behind, and held it out. "Mercer Ridge Ranch is 4 miles north. You can ask Cody for directions if you ever need them." Clara took the card without looking at it. "Thank you," she said, and was gone before Scarlett could say anything else. Scarlett walked back to where the wagon was hitched, and stood for a moment thinking about what she'd seen and what she hadn't said out loud about it. The high collar, the arm held at a slight angle, the specific quality of that glance over the shoulder. She had seen those details before, in different combinations, in different women, and they had never meant anything good. She didn't tell Wade about Clara Booth right away. It wasn't his business exactly, and there was nothing yet to tell that was more than a conversation and an observation. But she filed it alongside everything else she was accumulating about Harold Ames, building a picture she wasn't yet sure what to do with. What she was more immediately occupied with was the realization, solidifying through October, that Copper Bluff had divided itself into factions over her presence, and that the division was more pronounced than she'd initially understood. There were the people who had accepted Harold Ames's version of events and treated her accordingly, with cool avoidance or, in a few cases, active hostility. The wives of certain businessmen, a couple of the men who drank at the Copper Nail and had known Harold long enough to extend him a loyalty he probably didn't deserve. A woman at the church who had taken it upon herself to mention, loudly, within earshot of anyone available, that the standards of the community had to be maintained. There were the people who were neutral in the way of people who want to wait and see which way the wind is blowing before they commit to a direction. This was the majority. And then there were the people who had, for reasons ranging from their own experience to their own sense of fairness, quietly concluded that a woman who showed up, stayed, and worked without complaint probably deserved a different conclusion than the one Harold Ames had written for her. Mrs. Calloway at the Frontier House had become, in a reserved and practical way, something like an ally. When Scarlett came to town, she stopped to talk with her, and Mrs. Calloway talked back in a way that communicated information without wasted sentiment. It was Mrs. Calloway who told her that the wife of Councilman Briggs had been heard to say that she found the situation more complicated than she'd initially assumed. It was Mrs. Calloway who mentioned that the school teacher, a woman named Vera Hutchins, had made a point of speaking well of Scarlett to anyone who'd listen, though her reasons for doing so were unclear. Scarlett took all of this in and said little. She was not in Copper Bluff enough to navigate its politics directly. What she could do was conduct herself every time she was in town in a way that made it difficult to maintain the version of her that Harold Ames had invented. She was polite. She was honest. She paid for what she bought and said thank you and did not create scenes or court sympathy or perform distress for an audience. She simply was who she was, consistently and without apology. And she trusted, in the way you trust something when you have no better option, that eventually the reality of who she was would outlast the story someone else was telling about her. It was slow. It was genuinely uncertain. There were days she was not confident it was working. The conflict that had been building came to a head on a Thursday in late October in the general store. Harold Ames was there with 2 men from the business community, Caldwell from the bank and a man named Forsyth who owned the lumber operation and had fingers in several other things. They were at the counter discussing something with Purvis, and Scarlett came in behind them, saw the configuration of the room, and made the deliberate choice not to leave. She was there to pick up a supply order. She had a right to pick up a supply order. She went to the far end of the counter and waited. Purvis, seeing her, nodded once and held up a finger to indicate he'd be with her shortly. Caldwell and Forsyth noticed her arrival. Harold Ames noticed it last, and when he turned, his was the only face that showed real reaction, a tightening around the eyes, a faint color in his neck. "Miss Hayes," he said, in the particular tone of a man who has decided that managing a situation publicly requires acknowledging the problem element of it. "Mr. Ames," she said, "Mr. Caldwell, Mr. Forsyth." She had made it her business to know who everyone was. Forsyth looked at her with the bland assessment of a man who is used to calculating value. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I hear you've settled in at Mercer's place." "I'm employed there, yes. Interesting arrangement, Caldwell said. He had the voice of a man who spent his professional life implying things he would not say directly. It's a straightforward employment arrangement, Scarlett said. I keep house. I'm paid for it. She looked at Purvis. Is my order ready? Just finishing it up, Purvis said, and disappeared into the back with a kind of deliberate speed that suggested he did not want to be present for whatever came next. The thing about Mercer Ridge, Forsyth said, with the casual ease of a man who likes to hear himself think out loud, is that it's a significant piece of property. Wade's been struggling to keep it viable the past couple of years. Shame, really. A man with his kind of land ought to be prospering. Scarlett looked at him. That's interesting, she said. I wasn't aware you had a stake in the matter. A man in my position has a stake in the general health of the local economy, Forsyth said. If Mercer needs to sell, he should get a fair price. He's not selling, Scarlett said. Forsyth's eyes sharpened slightly. How would you know? Because I work there, she said. And because a man who is preparing to sell his ranch does not ask his housekeeper to plant a winter garden. There was a small silence. Harold Ames's expression had moved past managed discomfort into something that was trying to look like amusement and not quite making it. You're a forthright woman, Forsyth said. It was not entirely a compliment. I prefer honest, she said. It's shorter. Purvis came back with her order. She paid for it and said good day to the room in general and carried her parcel out into the street without hurrying, because hurrying would have looked like retreat. On the wagon ride back to the ranch, she sat with the parcel in her lap and the desert passing on either side, and tried to sort out what exactly had just happened. Forsyth's comments about the ranch had been too pointed to be casual. A man like that, lumber, money, connections, didn't mention another man's struggling operation in front of a casual audience without a reason. He was feeling out what she knew, and whether she was someone who would present an obstacle. She wondered if Wade knew what was circling his property. She decided to find out. She told him that evening after supper when the hands had gone and the kitchen was quiet. She told him plainly, without editorializing, what Forsyth had said and how he'd said it. Wade listened with his coffee cup in both hands and his eyes on the table. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she began to think he was going to tell her it was none of her concern. Instead, he said, Forsyth's been after the North Pasture for 2 years. The North Pasture specifically? It runs along the creek. Only reliable water source for about 8 miles. If he owns it, he controls water access for 3 other ranches, maybe 4. He looked up. How'd he bring it up? He said it was a shame a man with your kind of land wasn't prospering, that if you needed to sell, you should get a fair price. Generous of him, Wade said, with a flatness that contained considerable feeling. He was assessing me, she said, trying to figure out what I know and whether I'd be persuaded or obstructed. And which are you? She met his eyes. Which do you want me to be? He looked at her for a moment. Forsyth's not a patient man, he said. He uses pressure when he can and friendliness when he can't. If he's starting to ask around, he's stopped. He's probably been waiting for me to get desperate enough to sell, looking for signs. The ranch has been struggling, she said. Not as a question. It's been a hard couple of years, he admitted, in the careful way of a man who does not find it natural to admit hardship. Dry summer, lost some cattle to disease last winter. The house falling apart didn't help anything. I know how that looks to the bank. He paused. Caldwell was at that conversation. He was. That wasn't accidental. No, she said. I don't think it was. They sat for a moment in the kitchen's quiet. Outside, the night had come down completely, and the desert was the kind of dark that cities never achieved. Through the window above the sink, she could see a spread of stars that still surprised her on clear nights, even after a month of them. I'm going to start keeping records, she said. What kind of records? Household accounts, supply costs, what we have, what we use, what's being wasted, and what isn't. If Caldwell's looking at this property for the bank, he's looking at it as a going concern. A household that runs properly and accounts for itself properly is harder to dismiss. Wade was quiet for a moment. That's not your job, he said. That's outside what we agreed. I know, she said. I'm offering. Another pause. She could see him working through something. Not the practicality of it, which she thought he grasped quickly, but something else. The difficulty of accepting help from a direction he hadn't expected it to come from. Why? He asked. Because Forsyth is using your struggle against you, and he's also been using Harold Ames's version of me as cover for what he's doing around this property, she said. If I'm going to be an inconvenient woman, I'd rather be inconvenient about something that matters. Wade Mercer looked at her across the kitchen table for a long moment. You could have just gone home, he said, after the first week. Yes, she said. Why didn't you? She thought about it. Because this is the first place I've lived where I'm being paid what I'm worth, she said, and it turns out that matters more to me than I realized. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. Keep the records. She started the following morning, requisitioning a blank ledger from the supply order with a note to Wade that she'd added it to the list. She spent the first 3 evenings reconstructing what she could of the past 2 months' expenditures from receipts and memory, filling gaps where she could and noting them where she couldn't. By the end of the week, she had a working picture of the household side of the operation, and it was better than she'd feared and worse than it should have been. The inefficiencies were real, but they were fixable, which was the most useful thing to discover. She gave Wade the first summary on a Friday evening, 4 pages of figures with her notations in the margins. He read it with the particular focused attention of a man used to reading terrain rather than documents, and she sat across the table and answered questions when he had them, and left him alone when he didn't. You found where the dry goods budget was going, he said, about halfway through. You were ordering in quantities that made sense for a larger household than you currently have, she said. Things were spoiling. I've adjusted. He looked up. That's maybe $2 a month. Over a year, it's $24, she said. That's not nothing. He turned a page. You think the water pump on the south fence needs replacing? I think it's being held together by the optimism of whoever installed it, and that replacing it now is cheaper than dealing with the consequences when it fails in summer. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. She had noticed that about him. That amusement sometimes worked its way out of him sideways, through small sounds and almost expressions, as if the full version of it was something he'd gotten out of the habit of showing. Where did you learn to do this? He asked, setting the pages down. My father's business went under when I was 17, she said. I spent 2 years helping him try to save it. We didn't, but I learned a lot about what a ledger looks like when it's telling you the truth versus when it's being polite. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry about that, he said. Not perfunctorily, he meant it. It was a long time ago, she said. I learned more from failing to save it than I would have from it never being in trouble. He nodded slowly. What are you going to do with that? He asked. With what? Knowing how to read it when it's lying to you. She looked at him. I'm going to keep reading it, she said, until it tells me something that holds up. November settled over the ranch and over Scarlett's life in it with a quiet that was different in quality from October's quiet, less tentative, more established. She had been at Mercer Ridge long enough that the rhythms of it had become not automatic exactly, but familiar. She knew which step on the back stairs creaked and stepped over it without thinking. She knew that Tom drank his coffee with the cup held in both hands, regardless of temperature. She knew that Wade walked the fence line on the south pasture every Sunday morning, rain or shine, and that this was not a task he delegated. She also knew, because she was paying attention, that the ranch was doing slightly better than it had been a month ago. Not dramatically, not in the way that settled any long-term questions, but the small corrections she'd made to the household operation were having a cumulative effect, and Wade had sold 20 head of cattle in early November at a price Cody declared with cheerful authority was better than he'd expected. You seem pleased about that, she said to Cody at supper that night. He is, Cody said. He doesn't show it, but he's pleased. How do you know? Cody grinned. He didn't say anything was wrong today. That's how you know. Bill laughed, and even Dutch's expression moved in a favorable direction, and Scarlett served the rest of supper thinking that this specific thing, this table full of imperfect people eating food she'd made and occasionally laughing about a man they respected, was perhaps what she had been trying to describe when she talked about not going home. Not safety, exactly. Not belonging in any completed sense. Just the beginning of something that felt real to him. The trouble arrived at the ranch for the first time on a Saturday in mid-November. She was alone in the house when the horse came up the drive. Wade and the hands were working the north pasture, which was close to 2 miles out. She heard the hoofbeats and came to the front window and saw Harold Ames dismounting in the yard. She took a breath and went to the door, too. He looked different from what she'd seen in town, less composed, something underneath the surface showing through in the set of his jaw and the way he stood. He'd ridden hard. There was trail dust on him. "I need to speak with Mercer," he said. "He's not here." "Then I'll wait." "You can wait on the porch," she said, because she was not inviting him into the house, and she was not going to pretend to consider it. "I'll send word when he's back." His eyes moved over her face with the particular assessment of a man taking stock of how much someone knows. "You've been talking to Forsyth," he said. "I've been in rooms where Forsyth talked," she said. "That's not the same thing." "Don't get involved in things that aren't your business, Scarlett." The use of her first name was deliberate. She noticed it and did not let the noticing show. "My name is Miss Hayes," she said, "and whether something is my business is my determination to make, not yours." He stepped forward, not close enough to be threatening, but closer than necessary, which was its own kind of communication. "You don't understand what's happening here," he said. "I understand enough." "You should have gone home," he said. The pleasantness was gone entirely now. Underneath it was something she could see had been there the whole time, waiting. "You were embarrassed, and you wanted to save face. I understand that. But there's no future for you here, Scarlett. There's nothing here for you except more humiliation." She looked at him. She thought about Clara Booth's high collar. She thought about the way he'd laughed across the street on her first day. She thought about $5 attached to a letter with a brass pin. "You're frightened," she said. He blinked. "Not of me specifically," she said, "but of what happens if I stay. Because if I stay, and I'm simply a woman doing honest work without scandal or collapse, then the story you've been telling about me stops holding together." "I'm not frightened of you," he said, with enough force to indicate the opposite. "All right," she said, "then you won't mind that I'm staying." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned, took his horse by the bridle, and rode back down the drive without another word. She stood on the porch and watched him go. Her heart was beating too fast. She was honest with herself about that, alone. But her face had been still, and her voice had been steady, and those were the things he'd seen. She went back inside. She had bread to get out of the oven before it burned. She pulled it out and set it on the cooling rack and stood for a moment with her hands on the counter, breathing carefully, feeling the full weight of what she was doing in this place, and choosing, again, to keep doing it. Wade came back at 6. She told him about the visit over supper, after the hands had gone, with the same plainness she'd used to tell him about Forsyth. He listened. He was quiet for longer this time. "He came here," he said finally, not quite a statement and not quite a question. "He wanted to speak to you. He stayed long enough to tell me I should leave." "What did you tell him?" "That I was staying." Wade looked at her across the table. The lamp between them threw shadows up along his face. He was not a man who said the first thing that came to mind, and she waited. "Good," he said. Just the one word, straightforward and without ceremony, but she heard something in it that was not small. She started clearing the dishes. He got up and without her asking began to help, which he hadn't done before, and she didn't comment on it, and neither did he. The bread she'd pulled from the oven that Saturday evening turned out fine. She ate a piece of it the next morning with coffee and thought about Harold Ames riding up that drive and what it meant that he'd done it. A man who was confident in his position did not ride 4 miles out of town on a Saturday to warn a woman he claimed was irrelevant. Frightened had been the right word. She'd seen it and named it, and it had landed, and she suspected that was going to cost her something before long. She was right, though the shape of what it cost was not what she'd expected. The first sign came through Vera Hutchins, the school teacher, who stopped Scarlett outside the post office on a Thursday morning in late November with the brisk manner of someone who has decided to convey unpleasant information efficiently. "I thought you should hear it from a person who's actually disposed toward you," Vera said, without preamble. She was a compact woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and the particular confidence of someone who has managed rooms full of unwilling students for enough years that most adults seemed manageable by comparison. "There's a formal complaint being drawn up for the town council." Scarlett went still. "What kind of complaint?" "The kind with language in it about moral standards and the character of the community." Vera's tone was dry enough to bleach cotton. It names you specifically. The charge, if you can call it that, is essentially that your living arrangement at Mercer Ridge is an affront to the standards of a decent town and that the council has an obligation to address it. Address it how? That part's less specific, which is deliberate. Vaguer language is harder to argue against. Vera looked at her steadily. Forsyth's name is behind it, and Caldwell's. Ames is involved, but not publicly. He's too careful for that. Scarlett absorbed this. Around them, the street moved with its normal Thursday business, people coming and going from the general store. A wagon turning the corner toward the livery stable. 2 women with a child between them. An ordinary morning. When is the council meeting? She asked. First Monday of December. 9 days. 9 days. She looked at the post office behind Vera's shoulder without seeing it. 9 days to prepare a defense for a charge so deliberately vague that it gave her almost nothing specific to refute, which was, as Vera had said, the point. Who's on the council? She asked. 6 men, Ellison, Briggs, Patterson, Forsyth himself, a rancher named Corbett, and the mayor, who's a man called Hatch, and is essentially decorative. Vera paused. Ellison's wife came to see you, I heard. She did. We had coffee. Vera's sharp eyes went a fraction sharper. Did you make any impression on her? I don't know, Scarlett said honestly. She said I wasn't what she expected. Margaret Ellison says what she thinks when she decides thinking is warranted, Vera said. Her husband listens to her on things that matter to her. This might matter to her. She paused again. Corbett's wife lost a sister to a bad marriage. She doesn't have much patience for men who use legal mechanisms to manage women they've decided are inconvenient. Scarlett looked at her. You've thought about this already. I've been watching Harold Ames operate in this town for 3 years, Vera said. I've thought about it quite a bit. I just didn't have a specific situation to apply it to until now. She straightened her already straight jacket. I want you to know that you have people who'll speak for you if you want them, including me. Why? Scarlett asked. She asked it genuinely because she needed to understand it. Vera considered this. Because I've watched men like Forsyth use respectability as a weapon against women who wouldn't do what they wanted for long enough that I'm tired of watching, she said. And because you showed up here and you stayed, and that's worth something. Scarlett nodded slowly. Thank you, she said. I mean that. Don't thank me yet, Vera said. Thank me after the council meeting. She turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. I'd think carefully about whether you want to attend that meeting yourself. I'm planning to. Vera turned back fully. Good, she said. I was hoping you'd say that. She told Wade that evening. He took it the way he took most things that made him angry, very quietly, with a stillness that she'd learned to read as more significant than noise. Forsyth, he said, and Caldwell. Ames behind them. Ames doesn't have the standing for the council to care about him directly, Wade said. He's useful to Forsyth because he gives the moral argument a personal story attached to it. Without him, it's just a businessman trying to regulate a woman out of a property he wants. With him, it looks like concerned citizens protecting community standards, Scarlett said. Yes. Wade set down his coffee cup. What are you going to do? Go to the meeting and speak, she said. What are you going to do? He looked at her with an expression she'd been seeing more often lately, something between respect and a kind of complicated feeling she hadn't yet decided how to name. Be there, he said. That's enough, she said. I don't need you to fight it for me. I know you don't. I need you to be present so that when I speak, people can see I have the backing of the man who employs me. That matters in the practical sense, but I'm the one who has to make the argument. He was quiet for a moment, then, what's the argument? She had been working on it since her conversation with Vera, turning it over in her mind during the afternoon chores with the particular focus she brought to problems that had a right answer, if you could find the angle. The complaint is about moral standards, she said. They can't cite a specific violation because there isn't one. So I have to make the vagueness the problem instead of trying to defend against it directly. Wade frowned. What does that look like? It looks like asking them to be specific, she said, to state exactly what I have done that violates any standard of conduct. To name the action, not the appearance of one. And when they can't, to ask the council what it means for the town if a woman can be formally complained against for the appearance of impropriety rather than the fact of it. She paused. Because that's a precedent. And every woman in that room will understand what that precedent means for her. He was quiet for longer than usual. That's a good argument, he said. I know, she said. I just need to deliver it without sounding like I'm reciting it. You won't, he said. She looked at him. You don't know that. I've heard you in an argument, he said. You don't sound like someone reciting. You sound like someone who's figured something out and can't understand why everyone else hasn't. She absorbed this. Is that a compliment? I think so, he said, with the slight uncertainty of a man not entirely used to giving them. Yes. She spent the 9 days preparing with the methodical care she brought to anything that mattered. She wrote out the key points and then put the paper away and said them aloud to herself in the kitchen at night, after the house was quiet. She thought through every variation of counter-argument she could anticipate. She went back through the records she'd been keeping since October, not because they were relevant to the council's specific complaint, but because understanding the full picture steadied her, and she needed to be steady on Monday morning. She also, carefully and without making it into more than it was, strengthened her connections in town. She spent time talking with Mrs. Calloway, who knew everyone, and whose opinion of Scarlett had quietly solidified into something resembling endorsement over the past 2 months. She had a long conversation with Vera Hutchins about the practical characters of the 6 council members. She made a point of being in town twice in the 9 days leading up to the meeting, on ordinary errands, conducting herself with the same unremarkable honesty she always did, and letting people see it. She also went to see Clara Booth. She had been thinking about Clara since their brief conversation in October. The high collar, the arm held at an angle, the quality of the glances over her shoulder. She had not gone directly to her because going directly would have put Clara in a position she might not have been ready for, and because Scarlett understood from things she had seen in other women's situations that pushing before a person was ready was as likely to push them away as toward you. But time was moving, and the council meeting was coming, and there was something she needed to know. She found her at the milliner's shop where Clara worked 3 mornings a week, altering and trimming. She waited until the shop was quiet and went in and asked for a piece of ribbon she didn't particularly need, and while the purchase was being made, she said quietly, I wanted to check on you. Clara looked at her without surprise. She had the composure of someone who had learned to keep their face still, regardless of what was happening behind it, which was its own kind of information. I'm all right, she said. You don't have to tell me otherwise, Scarlett said. I just want you to know I haven't forgotten our conversation. Clara wrapped the ribbon with precise, practiced hands. He's been different lately, she said, in a voice pitched for just the two of them. Since he went out to the ranch? Since you didn't leave. Different how? Clara's hands slowed for a moment, then resumed their work. Angrier, less careful about it. Scarlett held that for a moment. The council is meeting Monday, she said. There's a complaint against me. Forsyth and Ames are behind it. I know, Clara said. He told me about it. He was... She stopped. He was pleased about it. Clara. Scarlett waited until the younger woman looked at her. If anything happens that makes you feel unsafe, Mercer Ridge is 4 miles north. That's not an empty offer. Clara held her gaze for a moment, and something moved in it. Not resolution exactly, not yet, but the acknowledgement of a door that was open. Thank you, she said. Scarlett paid for the ribbon and left, and walked back up the main street thinking about the particular kind of courage it took to not yet be ready, and how that was its own kind of courage, different from the kind that announced itself. The Monday of the council meeting came in cold and bright, the kind of December morning in the desert that looks like a painting of a different season. Brilliant sky, hard ground, the hills in the distance showing a faint wash of color that would be gone by noon. Scarlett dressed carefully. Not in her best. She didn't want to look like she was performing respectability. But, well, the dark blue dress that was neither too formal nor too plain. Her hair done the way she wore it on town days. The small brooch her mother had given her, which she wore not for decoration but because it steadied her, the way small familiar things do. Wade drove her in. They didn't talk much on the way, which was fine. She was going over the structure of what she intended to say, and he seemed to understand that and didn't fill the silence with anything that wasn't necessary. The council meeting was held in the front room of the mayor's office, which was too small for the number of people who had turned up. The 6 council members sat at a long table at the front of the room. Mayor Hatch, as Vera had predicted, had the air of a man who had agreed to run this meeting on the understanding that someone else would tell him what to conclude. Forsyth sat at one end with the composed confidence of a man who has arranged things in advance. Corbett, at the other end, looked like he'd rather be somewhere with livestock. Ellison sat in the middle and watched the room with the guarded expression of a man in the middle of a calculation. There were perhaps 40 people in that room, more than she'd expected. She took it as a sign of something, though she wasn't sure which way it cut. Harold Ames was there, seated near the back with 2 other men. He caught her eye when she came in and held it for just a moment before looking away. The formal complaint was read aloud by a clerk. 3 paragraphs of language so carefully constructed to sound reasonable that its hostility was almost invisible. It cited concerns about community standards, the welfare of the town's moral character, the importance of maintaining appropriate arrangements between unmarried persons residing in close proximity. It named her. It did not name any specific action. It did not allege anything except, in the most general terms imaginable, the possibility that something concerning might be happening. She sat and listened to it and felt the anger move through her like a current, clean and clarifying. And when the clerk finished reading, she felt steadier than she had all morning. Forsyth spoke first. He was good at it, she acknowledged to herself. Smooth and apparently reasonable, framing everything in the language of collective concern rather than personal interest. He spoke about the kind of town Copper Bluff aspired to be. He spoke about what newcomers might think arriving and finding such an arrangement. He never once said anything that was technically a lie, which was the most dangerous kind of dishonesty. Caldwell followed, briefer, banking on the authority of his position more than his rhetoric. Then Hatch looked at her and said she could speak if she wished. She stood. The room shifted the way rooms do when someone stands, who people weren't certain was going to stand. She let the shift settle before she spoke. I appreciate the council's time, she said. I'd like to ask a question before I respond to what's been said. Is that permissible? Hatch looked at Forsyth, then back at her. Go ahead. The complaint that was just read cites concerns about community standards and moral character, she said. I've listened carefully. What I have not heard, and I'd like the council to help me understand this, is what I have actually done. Not what it might look like, not what people might think, what I specifically have done. A small quiet in the room. I am employed as a housekeeper, she continued. I cook, clean, maintain household accounts, and manage domestic operations at Mercer Ridge Ranch. I am paid $9.50 a month for this work. I have been in Copper Bluff for approximately 10 weeks. In that time, I have not broken any law, violated any contractual obligation, or conducted myself in any manner inconsistent with honest employment. She paused. So I ask again, what have I done? Forsyth's composure remained intact. The concern, Miss Hayes, is not about documented misconduct. It's about the nature of the arrangement itself. An unmarried woman, living in the same building as her employer, she said, as housekeepers have done since there have been houses. In this territory, in this country, and in every other. Would the council like me to list examples? I have several, some of them from right here in Copper Bluff. Briggs, who had been quiet, shifted in his seat. The distinction, Forsyth said, is, I'd like to hear what the distinction is, she said. Stated plainly for the record, so that everyone in this room understands exactly what principle is being applied. Another quiet, and this one had a different texture. She could feel it in the room, the people who had come curious or hostile beginning to listen differently. She did not look at Harold Ames. She kept her eyes on the council. What I am hearing, she said more slowly now, is that the concern is not about anything I have done. It is about what an unmarried woman living and working in proximity to an unmarried man might, in someone's imagination, be doing. And I want the council to consider what it means if that is sufficient grounds for formal complaint. She let that settle for a moment. Because there are women in this room. Some of them work. Some of them live in arrangements that could be characterized uncharitably by anyone motivated to characterize them that way. If this complaint succeeds on these grounds, then any woman in Copper Bluff who makes an enemy of the right man becomes subject to the same process. The room was very quiet now. I'm not asking for special treatment, she said. I'm asking for the same standard that would be applied to a man in my position. If a man came to this town, found honest work, and did it well, I do not believe a formal complaint about the moral impression of his living arrangements would reach this council. I'd like to know why the standard is different for me. And I'd like that answer stated plainly, in front of everyone here. She sat down. Her hands were in her lap. She did not look at them. The silence held for several seconds longer than comfortable. It was Margaret Ellison's husband who spoke first among the council, and what he said was, "I'd like to hear from Mr. Mercer." Wade stood from his seat along the wall. He was not a man who made speeches, and he did not make one now. He said, "Miss Hayes came to work at my ranch because I advertised for a housekeeper and she needed honest work. She has done her job well and conducted herself with more integrity than most people I've known in this county. I'm not aware of any issue at Mercer Ridge that warrants the council's attention." He sat back down. Corbett, from the end of the table, said, "I move that the complaint be tabled for lack of specific allegation." The word tabled was a compromise. Not dismissed, which would have required Forsyth's assent, but set aside indefinitely, which achieved the same practical result. Ellison seconded it. Briggs nodded. Hatch called the vote. 4-2. Forsyth and Caldwell voted against. The meeting was adjourned. The aftermath was not triumphant. That was the first thing she understood, standing in the cold outside the mayor's office afterward, while people filed past her with expressions ranging from approving to studiously blank. Victory in rooms like that one rarely felt the way it was supposed to. It felt like surviving, which was not the same thing. Vera Hutchins appeared at her elbow. "You were very good," she said. "I was adequate," Scarlett said. "Good would have been 2-4. Vera almost smiled. "You moved the room. That's enough for today." Wade drove her back to the ranch without a great deal of conversation, but somewhere on the last mile he said, "You said what needed to be said." "I said what was true," she corrected. "Same thing, usually," he said. She looked out at the desert. The afternoon light was getting long, going amber. "Forsyth will try something else," she said. "Yes." "Caldwell will be watching the loan." "I know." "You need to be ahead of that," she said. "Before the spring quarter comes due, you need to have something that shows the operation is viable, something concrete." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about taking on a contract with one of the mining camps north of here, beef supply. It's not glamorous work, but it's reliable income." "Would Corbett vouch for you?" He glanced at her. "Corbett? He voted with you today. He's a rancher. If you approached him about the contract with his name attached, he's not going to loan me his reputation for a business arrangement." "He might," she said. "If you ask him directly and honestly, people respond to that more than you expect." Another quiet. The ranch came into view over the ridge, the gray house, the barn, the winter pale garden she'd planted. "You think like that all the time?" he asked. Not critically, with something more like genuine curiosity. "I think like what?" "Like 3 moves ahead." She considered that. "I think like someone who's spent a lot of years with less margin than she'd like," she said. "You can't afford to be surprised when you're working with a thin edge." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. The board on the porch step had been replaced so long ago now that she rarely noticed the absence of the gap anymore. "I'll talk to Corbett," he said. "Good," she said, and climbed down. The weeks after the council meeting were a different kind of difficult from what had come before. The overt attack had been repelled, but repelling it had made her more visible, not less. And visibility in a town like Copper Bluff was a complicated thing to carry. People who had been carefully neutral now felt they had to decide something. Some of them decided in her favor. A woman named Ruth Patterson, wife of the councilman of the same name, who had voted with the majority, came to the ranch on a Wednesday with a jar of preserves and a manner that was friendly in the guarded style of someone testing unfamiliar ground. And they talked for an hour about nothing consequential and about several things that were, and left each other with the comfortable feeling of having established something. Others decided differently. The woman from the church who had been loudly concerned about community standards was now loudly concerned about what it meant that the council had failed to act. She had a network, and the network talked, and some of what it said reached Scarlett in fragments that were unpleasant in the specific way of anonymous opinion, the kind of hostility that wouldn't look anyone in the face, And Harold Ames, who had sat in the back of that council room and watched his carefully arranged complaint get tabled 4-2, had gone very quiet. That was the thing that occupied Scarlett's attention more than anything else, because she had learned by now that Harold Ames's silences were not the silences of a man who had accepted an outcome. They were the silences of a man recalculating. Clara came to the ranch for the first time on a Thursday in mid-December. She came on foot, which meant she'd walked 4 miles in the cold, and she arrived at mid-morning with her coat pulled tight and her face carrying the careful composure of someone who has decided on a course of action before they can change their mind. Scarlett saw her coming up the drive from the kitchen window and went to the door to meet her. "Come in," she said. "Come in. It's cold." Clara came inside and stood in the kitchen looking at it with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has been moving under pressure and has only just stopped. Scarlett put water on for coffee and didn't ask anything because she recognized that the girl needed a moment before she needed questions. "He hit me," Clara said, finally, in a voice that was nearly steady. "On Tuesday night. I had a bruise on my cheek and I wore my powder, but it doesn't cover everything, and one of the women at the shop saw it." Scarlett poured hot water into the coffee pot. "Did anyone say anything?" "The woman at the shop asked if I was all right. I said I'd walked into a door." Clara's hands were flat on the kitchen table. "I don't know why I said that. I'd already decided to come here. I'd decided before Tuesday even." "You came when you were ready," Scarlett said. "That's what matters." "I was afraid," Clara said, with the bluntness of someone cleaning out a wound. "I'm still afraid." "I know," Scarlett said. She sat down across from her. "What do you need right now?" Clara looked up at her. "I need to know what to do," she said. "I don't have money. I don't have family close. He's telling everyone I'm hysterical and unreliable, and—" She stopped. "It's the same thing he did to you, before I even knew you existed." Scarlett sat with that for a moment. "It is," she said. "Does that mean it'll go the same way?" "No," Scarlett said. "Because you have something I didn't when I got off that train." She paused. "You have someone who knows this town and knows what he does and is not going to let him rewrite it." Clara looked at her for a long time. Her eyes were very steady for someone who had walked 4 miles in the cold after being afraid. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You could stay out of it. It would be safer." Scarlett thought about what to say. She thought about $5 attached to a letter with a brass pin. She thought about standing on a train platform in front of strangers with her chin up. She thought about the council room and 4-2 and Wade's one-word answer at the kitchen table. "Because I know what it costs to not have someone in your corner," she said, "and I can afford to be in yours." The coffee finished and she poured it, and they sat at the table in the kitchen that Scarlett had scrubbed clean in her first week at Mercer Ridge, in the house that was beginning to feel like hers, even though nothing on paper said so. And outside the garden waited under the cold for spring. Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. "What do we do first?" she asked. "First," Scarlett said, "you drink your coffee. Then we make a plan." And they did. The plan they made that Thursday morning at the kitchen table was not complicated, because the best plans rarely are. What Clara needed first was documentation, a written account of what had happened, dated and detailed in her own hand, describing the incident she could remember with the specificity that made a document mean something. What she needed second was a witness. What she needed third was time, which was the thing neither of them could manufacture. Scarlett helped her with the first part that same morning. She set paper and ink on the table and sat across from Clara while the younger woman wrote, not looking over her shoulder but present, which Clara had said without saying was what she needed. It took an hour. Clara wrote slowly and carefully, the way people write when they understand that what they're putting down on paper is going to outlast the moment they're writing it in. When she was done, her face was pale and her hand was shaking slightly, and Scarlett took the pages and read them without comment and then folded them and put them in the back of the household ledger she kept locked in the desk drawer. "Is that safe?" Clara asked. "Safer than most places," Scarlett said, "and I'll make a copy before the week is out." The witness problem was more complicated. Clara had the woman from the milliner's shop who had seen the bruise, a woman named Edith Crane, whose own history in Copper Bluff included a first marriage that people did not discuss openly. But whether Edith would be willing to say publicly what she'd seen privately was a question Scarlett couldn't answer for her. She knows, Clara said. She knew before she even asked me. She looked at me the way women look at each other when they know. I'll talk to her, Scarlett said. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. Clara looked at her across the table. There was something in the younger woman's face that had shifted since she'd arrived. Not lighter exactly, but less compressed, as if some internal pressure had found a small release valve. What are you going to do when this is over? She asked. When all of it is resolved. Are you going to stay? Scarlett thought about the garden waiting under the cold. She thought about the ledger and Corbett's name in her calculations, and Wade's almost smile at the kitchen table. I don't know yet, she said, which was honest. I'm going to find out. She drove Clara back to town that afternoon in the wagon, because 4 miles on foot in the other direction, at the end of a day like this one, was too much to ask of anyone. They rode in a quiet that was comfortable now, rather than careful. And when they reached the edge of town, Clara got down and straightened her coat and looked at Scarlett with the direct gaze of someone who has stopped trying to be small. Thank you, she said. Come back if you need to, Scarlett said. Don't wait until you're ready. Just come, Bob. Wade heard the summary that evening after supper, and he listened the same way he always listened, with his full attention and very little interruption, which was one of the things about him she had come to value without quite intending to. She's going to need somewhere to go if it gets worse, he said when she'd finished. I know. I told her Mercer Ridge was available. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know Ames was that kind of man, he said slowly. I'd heard things. Nothing specific enough to... He stopped. That's not a good enough reason. No, she agreed, but knowing it now is what matters. He nodded. Then, the document she wrote. You said you're going to copy it. This week. When you do, make a 3rd copy and give it to Vera Hutchins. She has a lockbox at the schoolhouse that she's used before for things that need keeping. Scarlett looked at him. Before for things? Clara Booth is not the first woman in Copper Bluff with this kind of problem, he said, with a flatness that contained a great deal of feeling. Vera's helped before. She knows how to keep things quiet and keep them safe at the same time. You should have told me that when I first got here, Scarlett said. You didn't ask. I didn't know to ask. He looked at his coffee cup. No, he said. I suppose you didn't. I'm telling you now. She accepted that and filed it alongside everything else she was accumulating about this place, and the people in it. The complicated, imperfect, layered reality of a town that was neither as hostile nor as safe as it appeared on any given day. December wore into its final weeks. The mining camp contract that Wade had been pursuing came through in the 3rd week, with Corbett's cautious but real endorsement attached, and the terms were solid enough that even Caldwell's bank would have to look at Mercer Ridge differently when the spring quarter came due. Wade told her about it the evening the papers were signed, in the same matter-of-fact way he told her most things that mattered, and she looked at the figures and told him it was good work, and she meant it without any performance. You suggested Corbett, he said. You did the asking, she said. Those are different things. He looked at her with that expression she still couldn't fully name. They're not as different as you keep insisting, he said. She didn't answer that, and they both left it where it was, and the evening went on. What she noticed, and tried not to make too much of, was that something between them had been shifting since the council meeting in a way that felt different from the gradual accumulation of practical trust. It was in the small things, the way he'd started to tell her about his day, not because she asked, but because he seemed to want to. The way she'd started to notice when his particular silences indicated worry versus tiredness versus the simple contentment of a man who didn't require noise. He'd helped her clear the table twice now without being asked. She'd started leaving the coffee on for him when he came in late from the pasture, without discussing it. Neither of them acknowledged any of this directly, which probably meant they were both paying close attention to it. She was not going to be foolish about it. She had been foolish about a man's intentions once already this year, and that experience had a lasting quality. But she was also not going to pretend she didn't know what she knew, because pretending was a different kind of foolishness, and she'd run out of patience for it. She filed it away and kept working. Harold Ames's unraveling came faster than she'd expected, and from a direction she hadn't entirely anticipated. The first crack appeared on a Wednesday in late December, when a man named Garrett, who drove freight and knew everyone's business as a professional consequence, mentioned to Cody at the livery stable, in the course of ordinary conversation, that Harold Ames had been seen arguing in the street with Forsyth 2 nights previous. Not a disagreement. An argument, voices raised, Ames's face red and Forsyth's expression the cold kind that was more dangerous than anger. Cody brought it home the way he brought everything home, with the slightly breathless delivery of a young man who understood the significance but not all the dimensions of it. Scarlett thanked him and thought about what it meant. It meant the arrangement between Ames and Forsyth was fracturing. She had understood from the beginning that Ames was useful to Forsyth in a specific and limited way, as the moral face of what was fundamentally a property acquisition strategy. But useful was not the same as valued, and when the council complaint had failed, Ames had failed to deliver what Forsyth had been paying for in social currency. A man like Forsyth did not maintain unprofitable relationships out of sentiment. She discussed it with Wade that evening. When Forsyth cuts him loose, Ames is going to have nothing left that he's been using to define himself, she said. He came to this town with money and connections and a reputation. If the Forsyth connection goes, the reputation follows. He'll blame that on me. He already blames everything on you, Wade said. He blames me abstractly, she said. I'm talking about the specific concrete kind of blame that makes a man do something stupid. Wade looked at her. You think he's going to do something? I think a man who's lost control of his narrative and his social position and his fiancée in the space of 3 months is under a pressure that eventually finds an exit, she said. I don't know what shape it takes, but I'd rather be thinking about it now. Wade was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to tell Sheriff Hale, he said. Tell him what exactly? That there's a situation developing and I'd appreciate him being aware of it. He'll want something specific. I'll give him what we have and let him decide what it's worth, Wade said. That's his job. Ours is to not end up surprised. She nodded. It wasn't a perfect solution because there was no perfect solution when the thing you were anticipating hadn't happened yet. But it was the right instinct, and she'd learned to trust his instincts in the practical matters the same way he'd learned to trust her analytical ones. Clara's situation came to its breaking point on the 2nd day of January. Scarlett was in town for the New Year's supply order when Edith Crane found her outside the dry goods store with the controlled urgency of someone who has decided to act before she can reconsider. He came to the shop this morning, Edith said without greeting. Ames. He came to find Clara and she wasn't there and she'd already left for an errand and he was… Edith stopped. He wasn't right. He was shaking and he smelled of whiskey before 9 in the morning and he said things about Clara that I won't repeat. And he said your name in a way that… She stopped again. You need to know this is past what I'm comfortable watching. Where's Clara now? Scarlett asked. I don't know. She came back to the shop after he'd gone and I told her what happened and she left again. I think she went to find him. Scarlett felt the particular cold that comes from information arriving too late. Which direction? She said something about his office, the building on the corner of Main and Aldrich. She found Wade at the wagon and told him in 6 words. He left the supply order where it was. They found Clara not at Harold Ames's office, but coming away from it, on the side street that ran between his building and the bank, with her coat wrapped around herself and her face carrying the expression of someone who has just had a door close on a version of their life. She was not injured. She was something that looked more like resolved. He's drunk, she said, when she saw them. He's been drunk since last night, I think. His business partner was there, the man who manages his accounts, and he was trying to talk to Harold, and Harold kept… She paused. He told me it was my fault, that everything that's happened since she came, she glanced at Scarlett, is my fault because I didn't support him properly, that if I'd been a better partner, he wouldn't have needed to do any of it. Scarlett looked at her steadily. Do you believe that? Clara met her eyes. No, she said. I did for a while. I don't anymore. Good, Scarlett said. Come on, let's get you out of this street. They were taking Clara back toward the wagon when Harold Ames appeared at the corner of Aldrich Street. He had not improved in the intervening minutes. He was in his shirt sleeves despite the January cold, which told her something about the state he was in, and he was carrying himself with the unsteady deliberateness of a man who is drunk enough to be reckless, but not enough to be incoherent, which was in some ways the most dangerous combination. He saw them from 40 feet away and stopped. "Clara," he said. "We're leaving, Harold," Clara said. Her voice was steadier than Scarlett would have predicted. "You don't talk to me like that," he said. He started toward them. Wade stepped forward, not aggressively. He didn't put his hands up or change his posture into anything that looked like a challenge, but he moved to be between Ames and the two women with the economy of a man who has decided where he's going to stand and has no uncertainty about it. "That's close enough, Ames," he said. Harold Ames stopped. He looked at Wade, then past him at Scarlett, and his face did something complicated and ugly. "You," he said, "you did this. All of it. Everything I had. You did this," Scarlett said, from behind Wade's shoulder. Not loudly, not with heat. Just the flat truth of it, stated plainly. "Every decision was yours. I was not there. I did not come to this town to destroy anything you had. I came here to survive something you did to me. The rest of it," she paused. "The rest of it is what happened when people saw who you actually were." Something moved across his face that she could only read as the specific pain of a man hearing something true that he cannot refuse to recognize. Then it collapsed into something harder. "You think you're better than me," he said. "I think I'm different from you," she said. "I'm not sure better has anything to do with it." For a moment nothing moved. Then Ames's right hand went to his coat, the coat he'd apparently come back outside to collect, or had been wearing after all chasse. And she saw, before she fully processed what she was seeing, that there was a pistol in his hand. The street did what streets do in those moments. It went very still, the ordinary sounds dropping away, the people nearby stopping and backing, and the whole world narrowing to the distance between them. Wade said quietly, "Harold, put that down." "You don't get to tell me. I'm not telling you anything." Wade's voice was even. She had noticed before that he was not a man who raised his voice when things became serious. He had the opposite quality. The more serious the situation, the quieter he got, and there was something in that quietness that was steadier than noise would have been. "I'm asking, put it down." Ames's hand was shaking. The pistol, a small revolver, the kind a man carries in a city and has never pointed at anyone, was pointed in a general direction that encompassed all three of them without settling precisely on anyone. He was crying, she realized, or near enough that the distinction didn't matter. His face was doing the thing faces do when a man who has decided he does not cry arrives somewhere that dismantles that decision. "I had plans," he said. "I had everything worked out. And then, Harold!" It was Clara who spoke. She had stepped out from behind Wade's shoulder and was standing where Ames could see her clearly. "Put the gun down, please. Whatever you think this is going to fix, it won't." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted when he did. Not softened exactly, but changed in quality, the way a wound changes when someone acknowledges it directly. "You were going to leave me," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "I was. Because of her. Because of you," Clara said. "Harold, put it down." The sound that came from somewhere behind and to the left of Ames was the unmistakable and specific sound of a revolver being cocked by someone who was not Harold Ames. Sheriff Hale stepped out from the gap between two buildings with his weapon level and his face carrying the professional calm of a man who had been in enough of these situations to have stopped finding them surprising. "Mr. Ames," Hale said, "I'm going to need you to set that on the ground." Ames went still. The hand holding the revolver had stopped shaking, which was not an improvement. It was the stillness of a man who has reached a decision point and is calculating whether to take it. 3 seconds. 4. The street held its breath. Then Harold Ames lowered the gun and set it on the ground and put both hands at his sides. And something went out of him when he did. Some wire that had been pulled tight for months finally going slack. And he stood in the cold January street in his shirt sleeves, looking diminished in the specific way of men whose entire substance turns out to have been composed of the power they held over other people. Hale came forward and collected the pistol and took Ames by the arm with the efficient courtesy of a man doing a job. "Come on," he said, not unkindly. "Let's go get warm." Ames went without resistance. He didn't look back. The aftermath of a moment like that one does not resolve cleanly, and Scarlett was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. Her hand shook badly for about 20 minutes after the fact, which she dealt with by sitting on the wagon's bench and pressing them flat against her thighs until they steadied. Wade sat beside her without speaking, which was precisely what she needed and which she suspected he understood. Clara sat in the wagon bed, wrapped in the blanket Cody kept back there for cold drives, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Is it strange that I mostly feel tired?" "No," Scarlett said. "That's exactly what it is. I thought I'd feel, I don't know, something larger." "You feel tired because you've been holding something very heavy for a very long time," Scarlett said. "You just put it down. Tired makes sense." Clara was quiet again. Then, "What happens now?" "Now Sheriff Hale charges him with something," Wade said from Scarlett's other side. "Threatening with a deadly weapon at minimum. There were witnesses in that street, about a dozen of them. He can't talk his way out of it." "And Forsyth?" Scarlett asked. "Forsyth cut him loose last week," Wade said. "Word got around this morning. Whatever arrangement they had, it's done. Ames's accounts are in trouble. His business partner confirmed as much before the whole street scene. Without Forsyth's backing, and with this on top of it," he paused, "he won't be a force in this town much longer." "He'll find somewhere else," Scarlett said. "Most likely. And Forsyth still wants your north pasture." "He does," Wade said. "But he wants it through legitimate purchase, and he can't manufacture a financial crisis fast enough to force one. The mining camp contract changes those numbers considerably." She sat with all of that. The desert was going toward evening again, the shadows lengthening across the road back to the ranch, the cold hardening around them. "I need to write to my sister," she said, mostly to herself. Wade glanced at her. "Agnes?" She'd mentioned Agnes, apparently at some point. She tried to remember when. "She'll have heard nothing since October," she said. "She'll be assuming the worst." "What are you going to tell her?" Scarlett thought about it. She thought about what October Scarlett would have told Agnes, and what December Scarlett would have told her, and what January Scarlett now had to say. The distance between those three versions felt like more than 3 months. "The truth," she said. "Most of it." He nodded. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that had enough room in it for all the things they weren't saying yet, which she was becoming convinced was just the manner of how things moved between them. Slowly, with integrity, without rushing toward a conclusion that hadn't finished forming. She wrote to Agnes the next morning. A long letter, longer than she'd written to anyone in years. She told her about the train and the letter and the platform. She told her about Mrs. Calloway and Vera and Clara. She told her about the council meeting and what she'd said and how it had landed. She told her about the garden waiting for spring. She did not tell her about Wade, not directly, because there was nothing yet to tell that she could put into clean language without making it into something more defined than it was. But she told Agnes that she was staying, and that she had not been wrong to come, and that the woman who had stepped off that train in October was not the same woman writing this letter, and that she meant that as entirely a good thing. She sealed the letter and put it with the supply order to go out with Cody Thursday. Wade found her that afternoon in the garden, turning the winter soil in preparation for the spring planting she'd been planning since October. It was cold enough that she could see her breath. He stopped at the garden's edge and looked at her for a moment. "You're going to be here in spring," he said. It wasn't quite a question. She looked up at him. "I planted these beds in November," she said. "It would be a shame to waste the preparation." "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He came and crouched at the edge of the bed, looking at the dark-turned earth with his forearms on his knees. "The ranch is in better shape than it's been in 3 years," he said. "The contract is solid. The house runs." He paused. "I run better, since you came." She stood still with the fork in her hands. The light was the pale, clear kind that only comes in winter, and it made everything look very precise and serious. "Wade," she said, "I'm not—" He stopped and looked up at her. "I'm not saying this well." "You're saying it fine," she said. "I just want to make sure you're saying what you mean." He stood up. He was close enough that she could see the specific color of his eyes in the winter light, which turned out to be the particular gray-green of sage after rain. "I mean that you changed something here," he said. "Not just the house, not just the accounts. I mean that before you came I was surviving this place, and since you came I've been—" He stopped. "Living in it?" she offered. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "That." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything she'd come here with and everything she'd left behind in Richmond, and the $5 with the brass pin, and the 84 mornings she'd gotten up at Mercer Ridge and found some reason to stay. She thought about garden beds prepared for seeds not yet planted, and letters written to sisters with truth in them, and the particular quality of a silence between two people who are paying attention. "The fence on the south side of the east pasture needs work," she said. He blinked. "Before spring," she said. "If it's not reinforced, the cattle will get into the garden beds and we'll lose everything I've planted." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll get Cody on it," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to the soil. She heard him behind her exhale, not in frustration, but in something that sounded like a man who had said most of what he meant to say and was content to let the rest wait until it was ready. His footsteps moved away toward the barn, steady and unhurried, and she kept turning the earth in the cold, clear afternoon, and the season moved imperceptibly toward the one coming after it. Cody fixed the fence on the south side of the east pasture in 4 days, working in the cold with the focused efficiency of a young man who has learned that doing a job well the first time is easier than doing it twice. Scarlett watched him from the kitchen window on the second morning and thought about how much had changed in the 3 months since she'd watched him fumble with her luggage on the wagon and avoid her eyes. He met her eyes now. They all did. Cody, Tom, Bill, Dutch, with the easy directness of people who have decided someone is worth looking at squarely. She hadn't set out to earn that. She'd set out to earn her wages and survive the month. But she had learned, in the compressed and often painful education of the past 3 months, that those two things were not as separate as they appeared. How you earn your wages is who you are. Who you are is what people eventually see, if you give them enough time and don't spend too much of it trying to manage their perception. Harold Ames was formally charged on January the 4th, threatening with a deadly weapon, discharging the piece. That last one stretched the technical definition slightly, since the gun hadn't actually been fired. But Sheriff Hale was a pragmatic man, and the dozen witnesses on that street had all seen the same thing, and there was very little ambiguity about what it was. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of January, and in the days between the arrest and the hearing, the version of Copper Bluff that had believed Harold Ames's story about Scarlett Hayes began the quiet and largely unacknowledged process of revising its position. This was not dramatic. No one came to her directly and said they'd been wrong. No one held a public meeting to retract their opinions. What happened was smaller and more human than that. A woman who'd been crossing the street to avoid her now nodded when they passed. Purvis at the general store, who'd been carefully neutral for 3 months, asked how the ranch was doing and seemed to actually want the answer. Mrs. Calloway reported that the conversation she was having about Scarlett at the Frontier House had shifted in quality, from the kind of talk that manages a scandal to the kind that reassesses a person. She filed all of this away without putting too much weight on any single piece of it. She had learned, in 3 months, to be careful about the difference between progress and completion. Progress meant things were moving. Completion meant things were resolved. She was not going to mistake one for the other. He shouted. Clara stayed at Mercer Ridge for the week following the incident on Aldrich Street, which was Wade's suggestion delivered without ceremony. He'd simply said, that evening on the road back, that there was a room and she was welcome to it. Clara had accepted with the quiet practicality of someone whose options had been recently simplified by circumstance, and the arrangement had worked itself into the ranch's rhythms without disruption. She was useful, Clara. Scarlett hadn't expected that, or rather she hadn't thought about it one way or another, but Clara had arrived carrying skills that had no relationship to the decorative existence Harold Ames had apparently been designing for her. She could sew with real precision. She knew numbers and kept them straight in her head faster than Scarlett could write them down. She worked in the kitchen without needing direction, reading what was needed the way an experienced person reads a room. "Where did you learn all this?" Scarlett asked her on the 3rd morning while they were working through the week's baking. Clara glanced up. "My grandmother," she said. "She raised me after my mother died. She didn't believe in girls who couldn't do things." A pause. "Harold liked that I could do things. Right up until he decided he didn't want me doing them in front of other people." Scarlett shaped bread dough without speaking for a moment. "What will you do now?" "I don't know yet," Clara said. "Something of my own. I'd like that." She was quiet for a beat. "Edith Crane asked if I'd be interested in managing the shop." Not just the alterations, all of it. She wants to spend more time with her children. Would you want that? I think I'd be good at it, Clara said, with the careful honesty of someone who is learning to trust their own assessment again. I think I'd like finding out. Scarlett looked at her across the kitchen. In the 3 months since she'd watched this young woman glancing over her shoulder on a street corner, Clara Booth had done something that wasn't dramatic or sudden or the kind of thing that looked like courage from the outside. She had simply, incrementally, stopped making herself small. It was the most honest kind of change, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I think you'd be very good at it, Scarlett said. Did. The hearing on Harold Ames took place on a Wednesday morning, 19 days into January, in the same room where the council meeting had been held 6 weeks earlier. The crowd was smaller this time. These proceedings were official rather than political, and official things drew a different audience. Scarlett went because she had been a witness and was listed as one, and because she had decided early on that she was not going to be absent from the events of her own story when her presence was warranted, Clara testified. She sat in front of the assembled hearing. Judge Pierce, who had ridden up from the county seat for the purpose and the necessary legal apparatus, and she spoke clearly and without the shaking that Scarlett had half expected and been prepared to witness without showing she'd noticed. She described what had happened in chronological order. She described the bruise on her cheek, and Edith Crane corroborated it from her own observation. She described Aldrich Street. Edith Crane testified. She was brief and precise, which was better than elaborate and emotional would have been, and she held the weight of what she said without apology. Wade testified. Scarlett testified. Both of them described what they'd seen. Ames's attorney argued diminished state, which was accurate but not a defense, and extenuating circumstances, which was an argument that fell apart the moment Judge Pierce asked him to specify which circumstances. The threat to 3 people on a public street in front of a dozen witnesses was not a gray area, and Judge Pierce was a man with a reputation for not manufacturing complexity where there wasn't any. The finding took less than an hour. Guilty on both counts. Ames was ordered to pay a substantial fine, substantial enough that it would put a permanent dent in the accounts his business partner had already described as troubled, and was placed under a formal peace bond that prohibited him from approaching Scarlett, Clara, or Wade for a period of 2 years. Violation would mean immediate custodial consequence. He left the hearing without looking at any of them. His attorney had done his best, and it hadn't been close to enough. And Harold Ames walked out of that room diminished in a way that no reversal of fortune was likely to restore, because the diminishment was internal. The story he had told about himself, of a man wronged and misunderstood, navigating difficult circumstances with reasonable dignity, had been read aloud in a legal proceeding and found to be exactly what it was. Scarlett watched him go and felt almost nothing, which surprised her. She had expected anger or the particular satisfaction of vindication. What she felt instead was something more like the absence of a weight she hadn't entirely known she'd been carrying. He was gone. Not from the town, not yet, but from the space in her head where he'd been occupying real estate since October. She walked out into the January morning and stood in the street and breathed. Forsyth made one more attempt on the North Pasture in February. Through a legal mechanism his attorney filed with the county land office. A claim that a water access agreement from 8 years previous gave his lumber operation shared rights to the creek that ran through Mercer Ridge's northern boundary. It was the kind of claim that sounded substantial in the filing and became considerably less substantial when examined by someone who knew how to read a land agreement, which Scarlett did, having spent an afternoon in December with the original deed and every subsequent document in Wade's files. She found the hole in Forsyth's argument on a Tuesday evening and laid it out for Wade at the kitchen table with the relevant pages open beside her. The water agreement he was citing had an expiration clause, written in language that was easy to overlook and clearly had been overlooked, by Forsyth's attorney at least. It had expired 5 years ago. Wade read what she was pointing at. He read it again. "He doesn't know," he said. "His attorney didn't catch it," she said, "or caught it and hoped we wouldn't. We need to get this to someone who can file a counterclaim." "Vera knows a lawyer in the county seat," Scarlett said. "She mentioned it when we were dealing with Clara's documentation. I can write to him tomorrow." Wade sat back and looked at her for a moment. In the lamplight, the kitchen had the warm and slightly imperfect quality of a real place. Not the kitchen of a photograph, but of a house where people actually lived and ate and talked and figured things out. The stove she'd cleaned in her first week. The curtains she'd replaced. The ledger on the shelf that had become the ranch's honest account of itself. "I don't know what I would have done this winter without you," he said. He said it simply, without decoration, which was the only way he said things that mattered. She looked at him. "Managed," she said. "You would have managed." "Probably," he agreed. "But managing and—" He stopped. He seemed to be searching for the distinction, the same one she'd offered him in the garden in January. "Managing and actually being all right are different things." "Yes," she said. "They are." He reached across the table and turned one of the open deed pages toward him, looking at it without really looking at it. His hand was close to hers on the table. Not touching, present. "Scarlett," he said. "Wade," she said carefully. He looked up. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to let me finish it before you redirect me to a fence that needs fixing." She felt something move in her chest that she recognized but hadn't allowed herself to name directly. "All right," she said. "I know you came here to survive something that someone else did to you," he said. "I know you took this job because you needed work and I offered it. I know none of what happened here was what you planned for." He paused. "But I also know that you're the first person I've been around in a long time who makes the place feel like it has a point. Not the land, not the operation. I mean, being here. Getting up in the morning. Doing the work." He stopped again. "I'm not good at this." "You're doing fine," she said quietly. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not as a housekeeper. Not on the terms we agreed in the general store. I want to ask you to stay because you belong here, and because I don't want to keep pretending I'm not aware of that every single day, and because," he exhaled, "because I think you might be aware of it too, and I'd rather know than spend another 3 months being careful about not finding out." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp between them was burning low. Outside the ranch was quiet, and the winter was beginning, very slowly, to consider yielding. The garden beds she'd prepared in November were under a thin crust of frost, waiting. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a train in October with $42 and a letter that contained $5 and a brass pin. She thought about everything that woman had not known and everything she'd had to learn the hard way, and the particular shape of what she'd become in the learning. She had not come west to fall in love with a rancher. She had not come west for any of this. But she had come west, and she had stayed. And she had built something here out of the wreckage of an arrangement that was never going to hold. Something that was hers in a way nothing in Richmond had been. Something she'd earned with her own hands and her own mind and her own stubborn refusal to let someone else's cowardice define what she was worth. And across this kitchen table sat a man who had told her, on her second week, that he didn't have patience for men who used women as convenient explanations for their own failures, who had driven her to a council meeting and stood up in a room full of people and said she had more integrity than most people in the county, who helped clear the table without being asked and had never, not once in 3 months, made her feel like her presence was a problem he was tolerating. That was not a small thing. She knew the size of it because she knew now what the alternative looked like. "I'm aware of it," she said. His expression changed. Not dramatically. His face was not built for dramatic expression. But something in it opened that she hadn't seen fully open before. "Then I'd like to ask you," he said, "if you would consider—" "Yes," she said. He paused. "I haven't finished the question." "I know what the question is," she said. "Yes." He sat looking at her for a moment. Then, for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled fully. Not the almost smile, not the sound adjacent to a laugh, but the real thing, which turned out to be considerable and somewhat inconvenient for her composure. "I was going to phrase it better than that," he said. "You can phrase it better when we're not sitting in the kitchen at 9 o'clock at night with a land dispute on the table between us," she said. "Fair enough," he said. She looked down at the open deed pages. Her hands were steady. She was, she realized, happy, not in the uncomplicated way that happiness gets described in other people's stories, but in the real way, which contains uncertainty and imperfection and the specific knowledge that nothing is guaranteed and that you're choosing it anyway. "I'm going to write to the lawyer tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "And I want to look at the spring planting schedule this week. The beds are going to need additional soil work before we can—" "Scarlett." She looked up. "The deed can wait 10 minutes," he said. She closed the deed, and the kitchen was warm and imperfect and real, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the land waited for spring. February resolved Forsyth. The lawyer Vera had recommended, a man named Aldous Park, who had built a regional reputation on the specific pleasure of finding the flaw in someone else's confident legal filing, dispatched the water access claim in 3 weeks with a counterfiling that cited the expiration clause and attached a county surveyor's assessment of the creek's actual boundary. Forsyth withdrew the claim on a Thursday without public comment, which was the clearest signal that he'd received the information about the expiration date and understood what it meant for his position. He did not abandon interest in the North Pasture entirely. A man with Forsyth's temperament did not abandon acquisitions he'd decided on. But the mechanism he'd been using was closed, and legitimate purchase required Wade's willingness to sell, which did not exist and was not going to be manufactured by financial pressure given the mining contract's performance in the first quarter. Without a crisis and without a legal angle, he was reduced to patience, which was not his most natural mode and which, in Scarlett's assessment, he was unlikely to sustain indefinitely before redirecting his interest elsewhere. She told this to Wade in the language she'd learned over the winter. Direct, practical, without dressing it up. He listened and nodded and said he thought she was right and that he intended to spend the next 2 years making the North Pasture operation visible enough that buying it would cost more than Forsyth would want to pay. "Making it too expensive to want," she said. "Making it worth what it's actually worth," he said, "which is more than he thinks." She considered that. Same result. "Different philosophy," he said. She thought about that distinction for several days afterward, turning it over the way she turned over things that had more in them than they appeared to on first reading. There was something in it that mattered beyond the specific question of the North Pasture. Making something too expensive to take away was a defensive position. It was building walls. Making something worth what it actually was worth, that was something else. That was the difference between protecting what you had and understanding what you had, and the second one she'd found was always the stronger foundation. She thought about herself that way too. What she'd spent the past 4 months doing was not defending herself against people who undervalued her. She'd been establishing what she was worth, which was a different kind of work entirely, and which could not be taken away in the same manner, because it was not a position to be argued against. It was simply a fact that eventually became undeniable. She wrote all of this to Agnes in February's letter, in plainer language, because Agnes did not need the philosophical framing. She needed to understand what had happened to her sister, and why her sister was not coming home. Agnes wrote back in early March, a letter that was characteristically Agnes, half exasperated, half proud, in a way she didn't quite want to cop to, and containing, near the end, a sentence that Scarlett read 3 times. "I told Mother you'd find your footing. I want credit for that when I see you next, whenever that is, and wherever next happens to be." Wherever next happens to be. She folded the letter and put it with the others she'd been keeping in the drawer of the small desk in her room, which had accumulated enough correspondence over the winter to constitute evidence of a life being actively lived. Spring arrived in the way of desert springs. Not gradually, but in a shift, one morning in March, when the light had a different quality and the air smelled of something opening rather than something held in. Scarlett felt it before she understood it, standing at the kitchen window with her first coffee of the day, watching the garden beds in the early light. She was outside by 7, kneeling in the first bed with her hands in the soil that had been waiting since November. The frost crust was gone. The earth beneath it was darker than it had been in autumn, richer from the work she'd done before the freeze. The turning and the composting and the preparation that had seemed on cold November evenings more like hope than practicality. It turned out to be both. She planted through the morning, working bed by bed with the organized focus that the winter had taught her to bring to every task that could be done either well or poorly. Tomatoes in the south bed where the sun ran longest, beans along the east fence, peppers in the corner that stayed warmest, carrots and turnips in the north bed where the soil was deepest, a row of herbs along the path that she'd been intending since October. She didn't hear Wade until he was close, and she looked up to find him standing at the garden's edge, with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that she had no trouble reading by now, which was the expression of a man watching something he's glad is happening. He set 1 cup at the garden's edge within her reach and kept the other. "How long?" he asked. "Few hours more." He nodded. He didn't leave. He sat down on the upturned bucket she'd been using as a step stool and drank his coffee and watched the desert wake up around them, the light moving across the hills in the particular slow way of mornings that aren't hurrying anywhere. After a while, he said, "Corbett asked about you." She looked up. "What did he ask?" "Whether you were happy here." Wade's voice had the careful quality of a man repeating something that matters to him. "I told him I thought you were. You could have asked me directly." "I know," he said. "I wanted to see what I'd say to someone else." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "And?" "I said yes," he said, without hesitating, which told me something. "What did it tell you?" "That I believed it," he said, "that I wasn't saying it to be polite." She turned back to the tomato bed and pressed a seed into the prepared soil. The morning was warming. Somewhere on the south pasture, a cow was registering a complaint about nothing in particular, which was normal. "I am happy," she said, to the soil and to him equally. "I want to be honest about what kind of happy. It's not the uncomplicated kind." "No," he agreed. "There are still days I think about going home," she said, "not because I want to leave, but because the distance makes me—" She paused, finding the right word. "Aware of what I chose." You have to keep choosing it, every morning. That's not the same as uncertainty about the choice. He was quiet for a moment. "I know something about that," he said. "I know you do," she said. They stayed in the garden through the better part of the morning, and he helped with the heavier work when she asked and left her to the rest. And it was entirely ordinary and entirely right. And she thought about how strange it was that this specific thing, this ordinary morning in a garden in the desert with a man who had learned how to be present without requiring anything of the presence, was what she had actually been looking for when she'd taken a train west in October. Not the arrangement that had summoned her, not the life Harold Ames had written in his letters. This. Machi mokaditi ikispota. The wedding was on a Saturday in late April. She had not wanted anything elaborate, and neither had he, and they had arrived at this agreement independently and confirmed it with each other in approximately 30 seconds of conversation, which she took as a good sign. Vera Hutchins and Mrs. Calloway served as witnesses. Clara came, which was the attendance she had most wanted and which Clara had confirmed with characteristic directness. "Of course I'm coming, don't be ridiculous." Clara had taken over Edith Crane's shop in March and was running it with the decisive, organized energy of someone who has been waiting for exactly this kind of problem to solve. She looked different from the woman who had walked 4 miles in December cold to sit at Scarlett's kitchen table. Not different in any external way, but with a settledness to her face that had not been there before. The look of someone who has found out what they're made of and has stopped being surprised by it. Edith came. The Pattersons came. Mrs. Calloway's husband, a quiet man who seemed to exist primarily as ballast for his wife's efficiency, came. Corbett and his wife came, and his wife turned out to be a small, energetic woman who took Scarlett's hands in both of hers upon introduction and said simply, "I'm glad you stayed," in a way that suggested she had been watching the whole situation from a distance and had opinions about it. Cody and the hands cleaned up with varying degrees of willingness and success. Dutch wore what was apparently his best shirt and refused to discuss the matter. It was held at the ranch because there was nowhere else either of them wanted it. The late April morning was the kind that the desert occasionally produced, as if to refute the idea that the whole place was just cruelty and endurance. Warm and bright, the hills showing a wash of green that would be gone by June, the sky an unreasonable depth of blue. She wore her dark blue dress, the one from the council meeting, because it was the most honest thing in her wardrobe, not her best, but hers, without performance. Judge Pierce, who had come up from the county seat for the Ames hearing in January and had apparently decided Copper Bluff was worth the occasional visit, conducted the ceremony with the practical warmth of a man who has presided over enough of these to understand which parts matter and which parts are furniture. Wade wore his best clothes, which were clean and well-fitted, and showed that he had given the occasion some thought. He stood beside her with the stillness she had come to know, as his version of full attention. And when Pierce reached the part where he asked the question, he said yes in the same way he said everything that was true. Directly, without decoration, as if the truth were already obvious and what mattered was simply saying it out loud. She said yes in the same way. There was no dramatics moment, there was no transcendence. What there was the specific reality of two people choosing the same thing at the same time, in front of people who knew enough of the story to understand what the choosing had cost. And that was enough. It was more than enough. The reception was at the ranch, which meant food she'd made herself with Clara's help, and the particular kind of party that happens when people are actually glad to be there rather than obligated to appear. There was laughter at the table that was real. Corbett's wife told a story about her own wedding in Missouri that involved a runaway horse and a missing officiant, and which was considerably more eventful than this one, and the table was still laughing about it 20 minutes later. Mrs. Calloway found a moment to stand beside Scarlett on the porch, looking out at the afternoon desert, and said, "You know what I thought when you walked into my hotel in October?" "What?" Scarlett asked. "I thought, there's a woman who's going to be gone by Christmas." She paused. "I don't say that to be unkind. I thought it because most of them are." "Most of who?" "Women who arrive under difficult circumstances," Mrs. Calloway said. "Alone, with not much. This is a hard place. Most of them find it easier to go back to whatever they came from." Scarlett looked at the hills in the afternoon light. The garden was behind the house, growing in the first real warmth of spring, 3 weeks into the season and already showing. She would check on it tomorrow morning, same as every morning. It was her habit now. Not a chore, but something she looked forward to. "What made you change your mind?" she asked. Mrs. Calloway considered it. "When you told me you weren't going home," she said, "not because you had a plan, you didn't have one, but because you decided. There's a difference between those two things, and most people don't know the difference until they've run out of plans." She looked at Scarlett sidelong. "You knew it before you'd unpacked." Scarlett was quiet for a moment. "I was terrified," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I was more frightened than I looked." "I know," Mrs. Calloway said. "That's how I knew you were the real kind of brave." She turned back toward the house. "Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer." It was the first time someone had called her that. It landed with a weight she hadn't anticipated. Not heavy, but real. Substantial in the way of things that have been earned rather than granted. Later, when the guests had gone and the evening was settling into the particular quiet of Mercer Ridge after dark, she walked out to the garden one more time. The spring planting was coming up. Not fully, not yet, but the first suggestions of green were visible in the evening light if you looked carefully, which she always did. The tomatoes would be a few more weeks. The beans were already ahead of schedule. Wade came and stood beside her without speaking. He did this, appeared alongside her at the end of the day in the garden or at the window or wherever she happened to be, not requiring anything, simply sharing the space. It was one of the things she had come to understand was not a small thing. The ability to be present without making a performance of presence was rarer than it looked, and more valuable than she'd known to look for. She thought about what she had believed in October, about what she needed. She had believed she needed to be chosen, that the legitimacy of a life came from someone else's decision to select you for it. Harold Ames had offered that in letters and withdrawn it with a brass pin, and she had spent the weeks after the train believing that the withdrawal was what had broken something. She understood now that it hadn't broken anything. It had just cleared the space for her to find out what she was without someone else's choice holding her up. The lesson in that was not comfortable. She had preferred, if she was honest, the version of herself that was going to be saved by the right arrangement. She had preferred it because it was easier than the alternative, which was the exhausting and uncertain and occasionally mortifying work of saving yourself, of deciding who you were and what you were worth without anyone's confirmation, and then defending those decisions in council rooms and kitchen tables and desert roads with a pistol pointed at you, and getting up the next day and doing it again. But comfortable and true were different things. She had arrived at this ranch, at this garden, at this evening, not because someone had selected her for it, but because she had refused to let someone else's rejection be the final word on what her life was allowed to be. She had written the ending herself. It was imperfect and still uncertain in 100 directions, And the North Pasture situation was not fully resolved, and the spring could bring weather that destroyed the garden, and the mining contract had one more quarter before it proved itself. All of that was true. The ending was not clean. Real endings never were. They weren't endings at all, really, just places where one particular struggle resolved, and the next one hadn't yet made itself apparent. The frontier didn't stop being frontier because you'd survived one winter. It kept going, the way real life kept going, into terrain you hadn't mapped. What changed was who was walking it with you, and what you knew now about what you were capable of carrying. "The beans are ahead," she said. "I see that," Wade said. "I might get a second planting in before August if the summer isn't too dry." "Could be." She turned and looked at him in the evening light. Her husband. The word was new and strange and felt more significant in the quiet than it had in the ceremony. He was looking at the garden with the expression she had learned to read as contentment, which on his face looked nearly identical to his expression when he was doing practical arithmetic, which was one of the things she found endearing about him and had learned not to mention directly because it made him self-conscious. "Do you know what I thought the first time I really looked at this garden?" she said. "What?" "That it was too far gone," she said. "The soil was wrong. The season was too late. There was no sensible reason to plant anything in it." He looked at her. "But you did." "I did," she said, "because I needed something to be in the process of growing, even if it didn't come to anything, even if the frost got it, or the soil was too poor, or I wasn't here in spring to see what happened." She looked back at the green suggestions in the evening dirt. "I needed to act like the future was real." He was quiet for a moment. "Did it work?" She looked at the garden, at the beans ahead of schedule, at the tomato beds she'd check again in the morning, at the herbs along the path she'd planted because she wanted them, and for no more practical reason than that. At the work of her own hands, begun in November darkness, coming up in April light. "What do you think?" she said. He reached over and took her hand, which was calloused now from months of this place and warm in the cooling evening, and they stood together in the garden as the last of the light left the hills and the stars came out over Copper Bluff's desert the way they always did, without apology, without ceremony, in numbers that made every problem feel briefly the right size. The woman who had stepped off a train with $42 and a letter that contained $5 and a brass pin was standing in a garden she had grown herself, in a life she had built herself, beside a man she had chosen with open eyes. She had not been saved. She had not been rescued or selected or granted a happy ending by someone else's grace. She had stayed. She had worked. She had told the truth in rooms where the truth was unwelcome, and she had kept the accounts and turned the soil and refused every single time the option had presented itself to let someone else's version of her become the one she lived by. That was the thing no one had told her about this kind of life. Not the frontier specifically, but the kind of life where you stop waiting for someone else to decide what you're worth. It was not triumphant, mostly. It was not a series of victories. It was mostly just the daily decision to keep showing up as yourself and to trust that the work you were doing meant something, even on the days when the evidence was thin. But then spring came, and the things you'd planted in the dark came up, and it turned out that was enough. That it had always been enough. She stood in the garden until the stars were fully out, and then she went inside to where the lamp was burning and the supper was not going to make itself. And she brought the rest of the evening with her, and it was ordinary and warm and entirely exactly hers.